Service, and we are now recording.
Okay, great. So welcome everybody to the final exam review. We're going to have a couple of different people, some of the Psi Beta officers that are going to be taking over the review. I'm Dr. N. I'm going to be starting with the first couple of chapters, and then I believe Professor Bruton is going to take over, and then we're going to move on along the line. We are hoping to finish by 9:30, so it's not really a reteaching of the whole obviously a whole semester's worth of information. So we're just going to pretty much go through the keywords that are in the final exam handbook. So if you don't have your final exam handbook open, doesn't matter if it's a King one or a Wood and Boyd one, you might want to have that. This way, when you see the words, you'll be able to kind of have a reference to where I got them from, or where we got them from. Okay. So, all right. So we're going to start with major schools of thought. No, we're going to start with the perspective. Sorry. We're going to start with the what is the meaning of psychology? So the definition that we're showing is the scientific study of the mind and mental processes and behavior. Scientific method is what we use as part of the process of understanding psychology as a scientific school of thought. And the scientific method is the assumptions, rules, procedures that scientists use when we conduct research. So the steps in the method are, first you have to identify a problem. First you have to see a problem, and then you identify the problem, come up with a research question that you can answer based on the problem that you have noticed. You design a study. We're going to talk about the different studies, some of the different study designs. You collect data. That's the most fun part, I think, if you can get people to do it, to give you data. And then you analyze the data, which is also pretty fun. And then you draw some conclusions, and you communicate your findings through presentations, through journals, through articles, through books, and things of that nature. Okay, now we're going to go major schools of thought. Biological psychology, some of these you can get the major school of thought definition really from the title of the type of psychology. So biological psychology is basically how the structure and function of the nervous system and the brain is related. Brain, which is part of the nervous system, is related to behavior. So it's all about biology related to psychology. Behaviorism, again, focuses on behavior, just on the things that are observable and measurable. When we get to the learning chapter, that's going to be a focus on that. Cognitive psychology cognitive psychology is the one that kind of came up as the one that was going against the ways in which behaviorism really showed psychology to be scientific. So behaviorism didn't want to know anything about the mind. The mind was just the black box because we can't observe it, we can't measure it. Well, cognitive psychologists focus on the mind. They're saying it's not just about the behavior, but it's about how people interpret the stimuli that they're getting, and then base their behaviors on that. So information processing theory is one of the ones that comes from cognitive psychology, and it's basically taking a look at the mind as a computer system with the hardware, which is your brain, your nervous system, and the software, which is all the different processing systems. And when we get into memory, that's one of the questions that cognitive psychologists look at quite a bit. Psychoanalysis is really based on Freud's work, and when you get to personality psychology, you'll see more of that. And this focuses on the role of the unconscious in terms of your thoughts, feelings, and memories and how they affect your behavior. All right, humanistic psychology, it is the one that really embraces concepts of self-esteem, self-actualization, which is a Maslow concept, free will, and it's the precursor of what has turned into another school of thought, which is called positive psychology. And that is basically the science of happiness, the science of flourishing, anything that's looking at behavior from a positive perspective. Now, normally I say this in my class, for when we talk about positive in psychology, we're not talking about good. It's really the addition of, but except for this, positive psychology is the science of positive thoughts, positive feelings, the science of happiness. Evolutionary psychology based on Darwin, and it's focusing on human psychological systems and including memory, emotion, personality, and how these enable us to adapt to our environments thereby allowing us to continue reproducing and continue to, be a species in this world. So that's the evolutionary psychology focus. Sociocultural approach, that's my favorite, that's my background, and that focuses on social situations and cultures, how they influence thinking and behavior. All right, so into the research methods. As I was saying earlier, as part of the scientific method, we have to go through and design a study. That's what we do when we come up with a research question. So we follow that scientific method in order to be able to gather the information and then analyze it. So some of the ways that we do that is naturalistic observation. And again, take a look at the words because they tell you what it means. You observe and record behavior that occurs in everyday settings. So if you want to look at, teenagers, how they act at the mall, when we have a mall, you go to the mall and you watch them and you make observations. Laboratory observations are those that are done in a setting that's created by the researcher, the psych lab. And that you can obviously control what's in there more than in naturalistic observation. So you can kind of create your own mall and send some people in there and see what they do. Case study is an in-depth record of one or more individuals' experiences and behaviors, and it's usually conducted on people who have something unusual or some abnormal kinds of experiences or something that's not necessarily as easily rendered by the more quantitative kinds of things. And so you get interviews, you do videos, you do all sorts of, and you might even stay with the people for extended periods of time, like ethnographic research might be one of the types you might do as a case study. Survey is basically a questionnaire. You're all probably familiar with those. We get to do those questionnaires every semester with the EGL3 thing. And it's just, asking you questions, agree, disagree, trying to get your information, trying to get your attitudes from the questions. Now, when we're doing surveys, obviously, one of the things that we want to do, I don't know if it's obvious, but one of the things we want to do with surveys, that's a quantitative perspective in terms of looking for larger trends in the population. So when you do surveys, you want to get as many people as possible based on the population that's of interest to you. And the population is exactly that. It's the group that's of interest to the researcher. So HCC students might serve as a population. Now, of course, we cannot, as a researcher, go and get the survey to every single HCC student. There's like, I don't know, 18,000 or something in there. Feel free to put in the chat how many we actually have. Maybe it's 50, I don't remember. But you can't get everybody. So as a result, you want to get a sample, and you want to get a sample means you want to get the people that are from the group who are then going to participate in your research, and then you can generalize back to the population. Now, in order to do that, you want to have a representative sample. You want to have a sample that actually represents that population, that accurately reflects the characteristics of that larger group. So for example, I looked this up last night in terms of HCC students. If you want a really good representative sample for a study that you do of HCC students, then you want to have around 34% Hispanic or Latino populations in your survey. You want to have about 28% Black or African American, 13% white, 10% Asian. You want to have 40% male, 58% female, because that's what the population statistics show. All right, so correlation is another type of study, and this is something that we do once we gather information from surveys. This is one of the ways that we can analyze it. Correlations assess the relationship between two or more variables. Variables are just the things that we're studying, the attitudes, the behaviors, whatever it is that we're studying. Positive correlation means that both of the variables that you're studying, or however many you're studying, go up and down together. For example, the more you smoke, the more likely you are to also abuse alcohol. So when you have less smoking, you have less alcohol abuse. So they go up and down together. One doesn't cause the other one. Causation is not, correlation is not causation, but they do have a relationship where they go up and down together. It could be because one causes the other. It could be something totally different that's affecting both of them. Negative correlation is basically when one variable goes up, the other one goes down. So the more TV you spend, the more time you spend watching TV, the lower your grades tend to be. So more TV, lower grades. Okay, correlation coefficient basically tells us the strength and direction of that relationship that you want from that correlational study. So the closer you get to 1 means that you have a stronger correlation, and 0, if the closer you are to 0, means that you have no relationship. So for example, and I made these up, these are not actual correlation coefficients, but let's say smoking and alcohol abuse had a 0.85. Now, when you don't see the positive or the negative sign in front, that means it's a positive relationship, okay? Just so that's clear. If you see a correlation coefficient that doesn't have a positive or negative, it means that's a positive. So smoking and alcohol abuse have a 0.85, let's say, relationship, correlational coefficient. So that means that it's a pretty high correlation because it's a 0.8, and 0.85 is close to 1. If it was 0.25, it would be close to 0, so it wouldn't be a very strong relationship. So now we can say the same thing with TV and grades. Remember we said with TV and grades, there's a negative correlation. So let's say we obtained a correlation coefficient, same thing, 0.85, but now the correlation has a coefficient as a negative. You see that little, I tried to make it red, that little red negative on there. When you see that, it means that one of those, when one variable goes up, the other variable goes down, and the number tells you how strong the relationship is. So correlation coefficient is the number that gives you the strength and direction, which way it's going, positive or negative, and how strong the relationship is between the variables you're studying. Okay, now I said earlier that correlation is not causation. You can't tell from a correlational experiment, or sorry, a correlational study, my bad, correlational study that you actually, one of those variables causes the other. The only way to do that is to be able to run an experiment. So the experimental method provides information about causal relationships because you as the researcher get to manipulate one of those variables to see if it causes a change in the other variable. So when we do this, we need to have some sort of a hypothesis. A hypothesis is our prediction. What do we think the relationship is between, say, TV time and studying, or TV time and grades? What do you think our hypothesis is? What do you think our prediction is? What do you think is going to happen? So in order to do that, you have to then manipulate one of those variables. And in order to do that, you need to have groups. So the experimental group is the one that receives whatever the condition is that you're manipulating. And the control group is the comparison group. It doesn't receive that treatment. Maybe they get a placebo, which I'll talk to in a minute, but they don't get the same treatment. And because you want to be able to have a group, you can compare to whatever is normal, whatever the normal things would be, you want to be able to compare them. So random assignment basically is not the same thing as random within the population. Random assignment means that within the sample that you have, you're going to assign people to groups randomly so that anybody has a chance of getting in the experimental group or in the control group. And for example, a researcher might just flip a coin and say, you know, if you get heads, you're going to the experimental group, and if you get tails, you go to the control group. So either the person can have an equal chance of going into either group. The independent variable, that's what we call the variable that is manipulated by the researcher. And the dependent variable is the one that they're actually interested in. That's the one that is expected to change. Okay, so for example, you have two variables, violent video games and aggression. Those are the two variables. You want to see if one causes the other. So you're going to create a hypothesis that says playing violent video games results in higher aggression. So you're basically saying that if you play violent video games, it will cause you to be more aggressive.
No, that they're having this review for.
Okay, can you mute it? Thanks. The experimental group is the one that's going to play the violent video games because that's what you want to see, and the control group is going to play something else that's not violent. You know, they're also going to be playing a game because you want to make sure that they're doing the same thing or similar things to your experimental group. Otherwise, they're going to know they're just there for comparison. So both of them plays video game. Experimental group plays the violent one, and the control group plays the non-violent one. So in here, I'm going to take a second, if you guys are available in the chat, which one, violent video games and aggression, which one is the independent variable? Put it in the chat, somebody, anybody. Which is the one that's being manipulated? Video games or the aggression?
I think Are you asking like people to speak?
No, I'm asking you to put it in the chat, but if you want to speak, you can. Go ahead.
Yeah, I do think aggressive video games do cause people to be more aggressive.
Okay, so which one is the independent variable, the video game or the aggression?
The video game.
Exactly. Thank you very much. LaShawn, yeah? Thank you very much. Exactly. So the independent variable is the one you control. So for this experiment, you would be controlling the violent video games. And then the dependent variable would be the other one, would be the aggression, which you will then, if you find out that in the experimental group, they have a higher measure of aggression using whatever measure you use, then you can say that violent video games cause aggression. If you use a correlational study for this, you cannot say that one causes the other. Okay, thank you for that. All right, so placebo. Placebo is a treatment that has no effect on the dependent variable. So it'll be something that the control group would be getting. The placebo effect, however, is this thing that happens when you might actually see a change in the participants in the dependent variable because the participants are expecting something to happen. Because remember, you don't know if you're going into experimental group or if you're going into the control group. So maybe if you take a, if you're thinking that, if they do this a lot with medical experiments, if you do this with, to test different drugs, medications. So let's say you're thinking that the medication you have is supposed to help you with your depression, and then voila, it helps you with your depression, but it's actually just a sugar pill, which is not supposed to help you with anything. It's just, water, sugar, whatever it is. So that's the placebo effect, and that ruins experiments because it gets in the way of your being able to determine if the experimental condition actually had an effect or not. One of the other things you need to know about is experimenter bias. This is not necessarily something that is, malicious. The experimenter wants to do something to the experiment to make it more appealing for them, to make it come up to their results. But sometimes in subtle ways, the experimenter might give certain cues to the experimental group that lets them know that, that they're supposed to act a certain way. And so as a result, your results are tainted. One of the ways to avoid that is to use the double-blind procedure. And that basically means that both the researcher and the participants are blind. They don't know which is the experimental group. They don't know which is the control group. And so, the experimenter can't have any kind of effect on the group members, on the participants. All right, a couple more things in this. Difference between psychologists and psychiatrists. A psychiatrist is a medical doctor, and they go through the same medical rotations and things that any other doctor would have to go through. And so they are the ones that generally prescribe medication. A lot of them do tend to depend on medical therapy in terms of medicating you in some way or another for whatever disorder you might have, which you'll get to when you get to the disorder section. Psychologists are more involved with behavioral interventions, psychotherapy. They both do assessments of disorders, but psychologists are generally not allowed to give medication. Some clinical psychologists can, if they have, if they've gone through basically the training that they need to be able to get those permissions. But generally speaking, psychiatrists are the only ones that do that. Okay, so I did 20 minutes. That's not bad. Okay, so I did okay with that. Kate, do you want me to ask questions, or do you want me to just keep going?
I think it'd be fine to go ahead and ask questions.
Okay. All right, guys, if you want to put something in the chat, probably it's the easiest way to do that. Because you have about 2 minutes before I have to move on to the next chapter, the biology section. So if you have any questions on anything, any of the slides, just go ahead and put it in the chat, and I'll see if I can explain it a little bit further. If you don't have any questions, I say no questions, so I'm not staring at the chat like a lunatic.
Okay, here's a question. So a placebo is not a medication.
A placebo could be a medication, but it's not something that's going to have an effect. So, I mean, if it's like a pill, it's like a sugar pill, you might think of it as a medication, but it's not actually going to do anything to you. So a placebo doesn't have to be medication. It can be anything that allows the control group to feel like they're having an experiment, like the non-violent video games could be considered a placebo in some ways, because you're doing something in your control group. You think that it's going to have something to do with the experiment, but it really is just there as a comparison. How come I didn't see that question? Oh, you know why? Because I'm down too far. Duh, hello. Okay. Longitudinal research. Okay, longitudinal research, it means that it happens over a long period of time. See the word long in there? Developmental studies that are, across the lifespan, they do more longitudinal research. You might follow the same set of people from childhood, infancy, to up to adulthood. The problem with longitudinal is that you're going to lose people as they grow older. They may not be interested in continuing. And so it takes a long time. So that's how I always remembered longitudinal. The other one where you get people of different age groups all at the same time, just so you can compare them, that's called cross-sectional. Put it in here, cross-sectional. Let's see, anything else? I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next one. Biology is not my background, but I do really like it. So I'm going to do the best I can to try to explain these, because I really do love neuroscience and biology. Biological psychology, remember we're talking about the nervous system. And in order to be able to get information about the brain, we use different kinds of machinery. One of those is an electroencephalogram, which is an EEG, is the easiest way to remember it. And that records brain waves. You get those electrodes placed on the scalp, different parts of your scalp, and they locate the electrical activity, and then you see that chart over there, which gives you the reading from it. And people who are trained in reading those will be able to understand what is happening in your brain as a result of those changes in electrical activity. And we'll talk about the electrical activity in just a second when we get to neurons. The other thing that we do is, in terms of brain structure, we can use either a CAT scan, CT scan, or an MRI. They will both give you images, like a static image of the structure of the brain. A lot of times they will use it to find out if there's some sort of a cancer or something in the brain. They need to be able to look at the structure of the brain to be able to see that. And so you can see the top one is a little bit less clear than the bottom one. The top one is an example of a CAT scan. The bottom one is an example of an MRI. And so the CAT scan is also gives you the structure, but it's a little less clear than the MRI. The MRI is also much more expensive to do. Okay, so for brain functioning, how do you get to the PowerPoint slides? You don't. I just have them on here. I don't know, Kate, I can give you the PowerPoint slides, but I'm not sure how to get them to anybody because I just put them together. Images of brain functioning is it can be done through a PET scan, positron emission tomography, which shows the blood, oxygen, glucose movement in the brain, which will go up if there are certain parts of the brain that are focusing on certain things that you're doing. Functional MRI is the same way as an MRI, except now it shows metabolic functions so that you can kind of see what parts of the brain light up when you're doing something. Okay, perfect. Yeah, thank you. The meeting is being recorded, so you can go through it, and hopefully, I apologize for talking fast, but I want to make sure that we can get through the whole thing. So thank you, Kate. All right, so neurons. A neuron is a nerve cell. We have lots of cells in the body. They all have different functions. A neuron is the cell that works with your nervous system. So it's a nerve cell. And the different parts of it are the cell body, which is right here. It's also called the soma. That's the one that's got the nucleus in there, and it basically keeps the cell alive. Then you have these dendrites that look like little tree branches, and those are the ones that receive signals from other neurons. Then you have this long arm over here. In my class, I always kind of show my arm, so kind of make you think that that's your axon, and then at the end you have your axon terminals, your terminal buttons, and that's the part that releases the neurotransmitters and sends the signals onto the next neuron, and that's how they communicate with each other. Where they communicate in this thing called a synaptic gap. The neurons do not touch. Okay, they don't touch. They communicate in this gap, this cleft that's in between the neurons. The synapse is the point or the process where those neurons connect, and though they connect through an electrochemical process. So I'll talk about the electrical process, and then we'll talk about the chemical process, because it's both of them together that create this. ability for the neurons to speak to each other. And that's basically what they're doing. They're communicating with each other. Okay, resting potential. That is a neuron that's at rest. It doesn't have an impulse coming. It's just kind of, sitting there, I guess. And and when a neuron is at rest, it's got a negative 70 millivolt charge inside of it. And when you get some sort of impulse that comes, something that you hear, you see, some of your something from your senses, you touch, that creates an action potential. It gets picked up by the dendrites. The information gets sent through the axon. The axon has this myelination on it. This is the myelin sheath. This thing looks like marshmallows, and it makes the pulse go faster. And this is your electrical signal, basically going from the dendrite over across the axon to the axon buttons at the end. And so that myelination, the myelin sheath, makes that impulse, that electrical signal, go faster. And so when the impulse is transmitted, you get the action potential when you have this depolarization happening, where you get a lot of ions that are positive inside the cell. And so as a result, the charge goes from negative 70 up to positive 50, and that's about as far as it can go, and then it has to push it on. And so that's why you kind of think of it as like, it's like I used to use my arm. It goes around, like it goes to the very end. It's being transmitted down, and as it's transmitted down, the previous part it goes back to rest, and so it's kind of moving along just like in an electrical line that you might see. All right, what is going to happen when that electrical signal gets to the terminals? Here's your axon terminals. Well, now it's got to do something because it's been built up in these axons, and the electrical signal is done. It gets you to the very end, to the axon terminals, and now you've got these chemicals that are in there. Those are called neurotransmitters. And what happens is that action potential basically pushes those neurotransmitters out into that synaptic cleft, into that gap there, where now the electrical signal that was going through the axon changes to chemicals. That's why we call it an electrochemical process. So the neurotransmitters are not electrical, they are chemicals that are released into the synaptic gap. And these are the things that are then picked up by the dendrites of the neighboring neurons that have that lock and key system. So not all neurotransmitters get picked up by all neurons. So the one by all postsynaptic neurons. What we call the one that is the one sending the signal, we call that the presynaptic neuron, and then the signal, the neurotransmitter, goes into the synaptic cleft, and it's picked up by the postsynaptic neuron. So anything that has that lock and key for that particular neurotransmitter will be picked up by the dendrites of that neighboring neuron. So some of the different neurotransmitters that you need to know: acetylcholine, it's basically for muscle action, memory, sleep, dreaming. I believe it has something to do with Alzheimer's as well. It's one of the ones that has been noted for having a function within Alzheimer's. Norepinephrine is for cardiovascular functioning. We'll talk about it a little bit more when we get to the endocrine system. Digestion, alertness, it's one of the things that happens when you go into that fight or flight, which again we're going to talk about in a minute. Dopamine, mood, motivation, sleep, learning, lots of things, pleasure, attention, responding to rewards. That's when you get that dopamine rush, and that's that neurotransmitter that we talk about. Serotonin, also for mood, sleep, appetite, and aggression. Serotonin is one of the neurotransmitters that's used a lot in terms of dopamine as well, and norepinephrine as well, in terms of dealing with depression and being able to lift your mood, because the more serotonin you have, the more likely you are to have a better mood. It helps you get out of your depression. Endorphins are both neurotransmitters and hormones, and they're the ones that deal with pain and pleasure. So when you exercise, you release these endorphins, which make you feel pleasurable after your exercise, although during the time you're exercising, you might feel miserable. But afterwards, you feel really good. Okay, so here we are with the nervous system. The nervous system is made up of two separate types of systems. You've got the central nervous system, which consists of the brain and the spinal cord. The brain, by the way, it has this thing called plasticity, and that's how we continue to learn, because the brain is plastic. I always call it the brain is plastic. It bends and it moves. It's able to change its structure and function in order for us to keep learning. And it's changed by the level of experiences you have, as well as any particular damage that might happen to the brain. And the spinal cord is what connects the brain with your peripheral nervous system. Moving to the peripheral nervous system over here, this is the one that carries the information to and from the brain, which is your central nervous system, okay? Two parts of the peripheral nervous system. You've got your somatic nervous system, which controls your skeletal muscles and actually interacts with the environment. That's the part that's conscious. You're consciously interacting with the environment around you. And then you have the autonomic nervous system. I always see auto in there, or automatic, because that's the part that regulates your internal environment, your organs, your glands, your blood vessels. You don't want to be sitting around thinking heart, start, heart, beat, because it's happening constantly, So that is part of the autonomic nervous system. It just keeps you surviving. Within the autonomic nervous system, you've got the sympathetic and the parasympathetic system. The sympathetic is the one that prepares the body for action. It mobilizes your energy resources. It gets your heart beating faster. It gets your eyes to be able to get in more light. And that happens in response to stress, to fear. I'm sorry, I'm moving very fast. I know it's fast, but we have a lot to get through, so I will try to keep it. No, don't be sorry. I know it's a lot. I will try to be a little bit slower. Anyway, so let's see, let me go back to the peripheral nervous system, okay? It carries the information from the brain to the spinal cord and back and forth. It's divided into your somatic nervous system and your autonomic. Somatic is the one that engages that's conscious. It's the part that actually engages with the environment that you control, okay? Your muscles that you control. The autonomic is the automatic part, the part that's internal. It regulates your body environment so that you can stay alive. Within that, you have the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic is the part that when we hear the fight or flight, where all of a sudden, if you're scared or you're nervous, or you have some sort of stressor that comes after you, then that prepares you to actually fight. That prepares your body for that fighting movement, to be able to get yourself ready. And that means that your heart starts beating faster, you start sweating, your lungs take in more oxygen. Now, you can't stay in that fight mode for a very long time, because it wears down the system. So that's where the parasympathetic nervous system comes in, and that's going to be the one that helps you to calm yourself down. So like when the stressor has passed, or if you have some sort of fear for something and then you feel better, that's the parasympathetic nervous system kicking in, which is helping you get back to what's called homeostasis, or get back to a level of normal, where you're not living on such a high level of functioning. Okay. I think I had a little thing here. Okay, so the sympathetic nervous system, it dilates your pupils so you get more light in there. Your heart starts beating faster. Think about this. You've all been stressed. We've all been stressed. We've all been scared at some point. And so your system just automatically starts doing this for you. You start feeling less hungry. When I get stressed, I feel less hungry, and that's pretty much the only time I lose weight. It stimulates all of the adrenaline within the system, gives you, and that's called epinephrine, and that's what gives you the energy that you need to be able to fight it down. Parasympathetic, again, you cannot live on this high, your body cannot live on that on that high maintenance level. All of these different systems that you have, these organs are going to start shutting down. So we don't want that, which is why long-term stress can cause things like heart attacks, can cause things like high blood pressure, because when you have this stressor constantly on you, then think about the sympathetic nervous system just constantly trying to keep up with you. You need to have that parasympathetic, and that's why people do meditation and listen to music, try to get yourself back to a calm state, because you need to be able to do that in order for yourself to survive. Okay, Okay, the endocrine system, I kind of mentioned that the endocrine system works together with your nervous system, and it influences a lot of the different aspects of your human behavior, including your growth, puberty, reproduction, metabolism, plays a really important role in your emotions. The endocrine system has glands, and these glands are made up of groups of cells that secrete hormones. Hormones are the chemicals that move throughout your body to regulate those emotions and those behaviors. Because the glands are different in men and women, some of the hormones can also explain some of the observed differences you might see in men and women, but the endocrine system is what regulates that. The pituitary gland is really the master gland in the endocrine system. It's really small. It's like the size of a pea, and it's located near the center of your brain, and that really is the one that controls the body's growth. It secretes hormones. It's influenced by the hypothalamus, which I'll get to in a second. It secretes hormones that influence your response to pain, signal the ovaries and the testes to make sex hormones. It's what starts your puberties from kicking in, so that you start changing, becoming adolescent. That's the pituitary gland working in coordination with the adrenal gland. The adrenal glands are one atop each of the kidneys, and they produce hormones that regulate your salt, the water balance in your body. They're also involved in metabolism, immune system, again, in your sexual development and function. I put this in blue here because I want to make sure that you kind of see this, that the adrenal glands secrete epinephrine, which is also known as adrenaline, and that's what gets you into that fight or flight mode when the sympathetic nervous system kicks in, okay? And as well as norepinephrine, which is, again, one of the ones that I talked about earlier. It's also a neurotransmitter. So some of these neurotransmitters are also hormones, okay? All right, so into the brain, different parts of the brain. A lot of this you just have to memorize, guys, okay? Because try to find ways in your mind to try to connect it to things like mnemonics, which you'll get to in the memory section, can help you try to remember these different parts. So the brain stem, over here, it's like a stem, and it basically connects your spinal cord to the brain. It connects it to the skull. The medulla is over here. It controls your heartbeat, your breathing, your blood pressure, coughing, swallowing, all of those automatic things that happen. All of this, by the way, is generally automatic stuff. I used to, well, people might think of it as your reptilian brain, this little part here, because this is the part that is automatic and it keeps you alive. The cerebellum, which looks like a little brain, because the larger part that you see there, it looks like a smaller part of that. That larger part is called the cerebrum, and we're going to get to that in a second. The cerebellum controls your heart rate, respiration, blood pressure, things like motor learning. I always think of it as balance because I'm not very balanced. So muscle tone, things like that are related to the cerebellum's functions. The pons connects the two halves of the cerebellum, so they're on either side of your head, and it's associated with the sleep cycle, movement, and balance. I always think of it in terms of the sleep cycle. I always think of ponds as I see a nice pond and it makes me so nice and sleepy. So I think of it as that way. Try to find ways to remember it. All right, limbic system is within your brain, and it's involved in the emotional expression, memory, and motivation. The thalamus is, let's see, where's the thalamus? Right over here. It's the relay station for information that comes into and out of your brain, into different parts of your brain. The information comes in from your senses. The thalamus tells it where to go, what part of the brain should be processing it. The hypothalamus, I mentioned that earlier because the hypothalamus is the one that regulates hunger, thirst, sexual behavior, body temperature, emotional behaviors, and it's related to the endocrine system because it's the one that talks to the glands, the pituitary gland and the adrenal gland, and gets all of that working together. The hippocampus is the one for memory. I always think of the hippo being on campus. Where do you go to learn things? Where do you go to remember things? You go to the campus where the hippo goes. So hippocampus for memory and storage. Amygdala, I don't know, that just looks like a scary name to me. So amygdala is fear, aggression, the emotional memory is all part of your amygdala, and those are part of the limbic system. Okay, Cerebrum, that's what I was talking about earlier. It's that larger part of the brain. It's that thinking part of the brain where most of what we think about as thinking inside actually occurs. The cerebral cortex is the outermost part of it. It's like the bark of a tree. It's a very thin covering, and it's responsible for all your higher mental processes like memory, language, thinking. And it's got this gray color, which is why a lot of times when you think, when you hear the word gray matter, that's what they're talking about. They're talking about the cerebral cortex. When we talk about white matter, I don't know if you've heard of white matter. White matter, when they're talking about that, they're referring back to the myelin sheath that's on some of the neurons. So the white matter refers to myelination. The gray matter refers to the cerebral cortex, which is the actual neurons. They have that grayish color. The cerebrum is separated into two sides, two parts. And those parts are called cerebral hemispheres. As you can kind of see, the left hemisphere has to do with reasoning, numerical skills, and it controls the right side of the body. So it goes in pretty much the opposite direction. So the left side of your brain controls the right part of your body. The right side of your brain, the right hemisphere, controls the left side of your body. Right hemisphere has to do with more emotional thinking, music, spatial, visual, spatial types of things. Corpus callosum is that thing right in the center, and that is the little band that connects both parts of the brain so that they can talk to each other. All right, so the different lobes. The brain is also divided into different lobes. The frontal lobe is that big lobe right in the front, frontal lobe, and that's for decision making, judgment, higher order thinking, planning. It's also where the motor cortex is, and the motor cortex is what we were talking about earlier in terms of voluntary movements. And so that is the part that controls any of the voluntary movements that you do, conscious movements that you do. Of your motor means muscles. Association areas. All these different, the association areas are in the front, but they're basically the areas that link up and connect to all of the different lobes that that process the different types of information. So over here you've got the occipital lobe, which is in the back. I always think about it as like eyes. You know, your mom has eyes in the back of her head. So that's where the occipital lobe is in the back, and that's for basically for vision is processed over there. The side. Right over here, right by your ears, it's your temporal lobe, right by your ears. That's where your hearing is processed. And then you have the very top, which is called the parietal lobe. And what I do in my class is that, because the only way I can think of it is like I think of like a piranha. You know, piranha is like that fish that eats you. You don't want to be eaten by piranha. So anyway, piranha, I always think of like the parietal lobe as this piranha that's eating the top of my brain. And if it's, chewing on the top of my brain, I'm going to say, ow, that hurts, because that's where the parietal lobe is, where things like touch and pain tend to be processed. So all of those different areas send information to the frontal association areas in order to be linked up and to store the memories of them. The Broca'S area is over here on the side near where the speech is located, and it functions in speech production. Broca'S Aphasia. Aphasia means that there's when a lot of times aphasias happen when you have some sort of traumatic brain injury, and Broca'S aphasia in this person, particular type of aphasia. Are you saying something? Hi. Sorry. Broca'S aphasia is people know what they want to say. They know what they want to say. They can process that information in their minds, but they can't actually say it. So that's what Broca'S aphasia means, because it's some dysfunction of the Broca'S area. Okay. Was that it? I think that's it. I think that was it. I am on time. Okay. Any questions?
Great job.
Thank you, everybody. I know it was fast, and I apologize.
Thank you, Dr.
I
Rin.
apologize. All right, I'm gonna log off so you can move on to the next part. Okay, I'll be back in a little bit. I'm still gonna be here, but I'm logging my stuff off. I'm gonna mute myself. Okay.
Thank you. Lisa, if you don't mind, give me a couple minutes. There's another student who's trying to get into the meeting, and I'm going to try to give them access and send them a link again. So I'll be ready to start in a few moments, but if any of you have any questions about anything that's been talked about so far, please type your questions in the chat, and I'll be right back. And again, thank you, Dr. In. That was fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Thank you. I saw one question, but I wasn't sure what actually meant. So.
Nosheen, if you could go ahead and email the PowerPoint presentation to me, I'll get the file up and ready and be able to share it with everybody. Okay, 1 second, and I'm going to read off your questions. For those of you that are just joining or came in midway through the presentation, this entire presentation is being recorded. The recording started at 6:30. So if a presenter is going through and maybe they're going through something very quickly, just know that we will be sharing the link to this presentation tomorrow once it's been prepared. And so just notate the time on your clock and then just fast forward to that point. And if you have any questions, do type them in the chat. And once there's a break in between presenters, then we will go ahead and address all questions in the chat area. If you're currently a student of mine and you have questions about anything pertaining to a specific class for a specific instructor that may be here or presenting, go ahead and send a separate email to the instructor. And also, as soon as Kate comes back on and Nosheen comes back on, basically we're going to get all the slides that you see put together and also send that out with the link to the recording. So you'll have everything that you see and you hear tonight available to you tomorrow once we have that all gathered together, okay? And if for those of you that haven't figured out where the chat button is, go ahead and click on the little dots on your screen and you'll see like a little message bubble, and then just typing your question into that box. And when Kate and Nosheen come back on, if they have any questions specific to what they just presented, that they'll be able to answer that for you, okay? All right, so all right, I'm looking up through the questions. Okay, don't worry, again, don't worry about if your signal is cutting in and out. You'll be able to review all of this tomorrow. As far as someone asked the question, the best way to increase dopamine is basically pleasurable activities will increase dopamine. And it was asked if neurotransmitters prevent impulses from flowing from one neuron to another. Neurotransmitters are basically the chemical messengers for a synapse. Does that make sense? No, this is not it for the presentation. We have 3 more presenters coming. We're just taking a short break in between presentations to be able to answer questions for that specific presenter. And so actually Kate is getting ready to present whenever she is ready. Okay. Kate, you are a presenter, so you should be able to start presenting whenever you are ready.
All right, everybody, thank you for your patience there. I was trying to help one of your fellow students be ready to present. So you should hear me speaking. Can you hear me speaking?
Yes.
Oh, great. So I'm Professor Catherine Bruton. I am a psychology instructor here at HCC, and I am going to talk to all of you about learning and memory, and also a couple of other topics as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start sharing my screen here with all of you, and I want to show you a resource just really quick. I've been sharing this in the chat, but here is a Psych 2301 Departmental Final Exam Student Resources. Hopefully you have seen this link before. And I've been putting this link in the chat repeatedly so that you can see it in the chat. And you'll notice here, you'll have the final exam handbook, learning objectives, key terms. You also have they have a final exam workbook. You also have some textbook resources, okay? And so on my computer, I already have those textbook resources here. So you have, many of you are using Laura A. King. Many of you are also using Woodward and Boyd. And so you also have the final exam, departmental final exam handbook. So again, thank you for those of you who are just joining. If you don't mind, please be sure to mute your microphones and turn off your cameras. This meeting is being recorded for future viewing, and we will send out the link of the recording when it becomes available. So let's get started talking about behavior and learning, okay? So this is using the King textbook. So the first key term is learning, okay? So we have been learning all of our lives. So learning is a change in behavior or knowledge due to experience, okay? So the behaviorists, they were all about your experiences. They're all about what you have experienced and also all about your observable behaviors. So that's what learning is, okay? And the neat thing is about learning, you learn your entire life. Excuse me, you learn your entire life. So when you're learning, you have these new neurons that are made, and you can learn something until the day you draw your last breath, okay? So you can continue to have new behaviors and new knowledge as a result of new experiences that you have, okay? So the first kind of conditioning we're going to be talking about here is classical conditioning, okay? So classical conditioning was discovered by accident by Ivan Pavlov. Ivan Pavlov was actually studying digestion. And what he did was he saw that the dogs started salivating even when they weren't being fed. And so what he did is he conducted an experiment. So I'm going to go to the departmental final exam handbook that is on that website that I just showed you. And I am going to go down to the module on learning. And I am going to show you one of the diagrams here, okay? So this diagram is in your workbook. It's also in your textbooks. It's also in other resources. So what he found is that the dogs would associate different sounds with food. So what you have is something known as an unconditioned stimulus. So an unconditioned stimulus is any stimulus that naturally elicits a response. So the food is an unconditioned stimulus, okay? You don't have to sit down and tell a dog, okay, so when you eat food, you need to start salivating, okay? Dogs naturally salivate when they have food, okay? And so the unconditioned response, okay, unconditioned response is salivation. Okay, so the unconditioned response is a response that naturally happens in response to a stimulus, okay? So the dog does not have to be taught to salivate at food, okay? So one of the stimuli that Pavlov played around with was a whistle. He also did stuff with metronomes and bells and things like that. But the thing about a whistle is a whistle does not naturally salivate at a whistle. Dogs don't naturally salivate at whistles, okay? So a dog, when you blow a whistle, a dog might perk up its ears and look around, but they're not going to salivate more than likely, okay? So this is a neutral stimulus. So this is not something that naturally elicits salivation, okay? So naturally, the dog is not going to salivate at the whistle, okay? So what happens during conditioning is the whistle is paired with the food. So after the whistle is paired with food a few times, eventually what happens is the dog just starts salivating at the whistle. Okay, so once the dog starts salivating at the whistle has become a conditioned stimulus, and salivation in response to the whistle has become a conditioned response. Okay, and has become a conditioned response. All right. So many of you might have heard of Watson, okay? John Watson. John Watson also did work with classical conditioning. He did his Little Albert study, if you could recall. So remember that Little Albert, Watson conditioned Little Albert to fear white rats. And what he did was he paired a white rat with a loud bang, a loud gong sound, and Little Albert cried. And so Little Albert became to associate the white rat with the loud sound. So the white rat became a conditioned stimulus for fear, which was a conditioned response to the rat. And so what happened was Little Albert was not only afraid of the white rat, Little Albert became afraid of everything white or fluffy. This is called stimulus generalization. This is when an organism generalizes their response to stimuli that are similar. So Little Albert started to be afraid of not only white rats, he also started to be afraid of things like, Santa beards. He was afraid of even things like, any like white fluffy cotton and things of that nature. So he was, became afraid of anything white or fluffy. Okay. And so that's stimulus generalization. Now, stimulus discrimination, okay? Stimulus discrimination is if Little Albert had only become afraid of the white rat and wasn't afraid of anything else white or fluffy, and it was only afraid of the white rat, that would have been stimulus discrimination. Now, discrimination in the regular sense, you might be thinking of discrimination against people of different groups, but this is not what we're talking about. We're talking about discrimination as it comes to differentiating between different stimuli, okay? So if Little Albert was only afraid of the white rat, then that would be stimulus discrimination. But Little Albert became afraid of anything white or fluffy after becoming afraid of the white rat. So that's stimulus generalization, okay? However, had Watson done the ethical thing and helped Little Albert overcome his fear of white rats, so for example, had he went ahead and present the white rat without anything scary and continued to present the white rat without anything scary, eventually Little Albert would hopefully have his fear of white rats extinguished, okay? And what extinction means is that you no longer respond to that stimulus, okay? You no longer respond to the stimulus in the way that you did before. So for example, if I have a fear of wasps and I go to therapy, for example, exposure therapy, and I go to therapy and then I'm no longer afraid of wasps, that is because during exposure therapy, the relationship between the wasp and pain that caused me fear has been extinguished, okay? Spontaneous recovery can happen though. What happens with spontaneous recovery is this is when all of a sudden is when all of a sudden the fear comes back or the association comes back. So for example, let's say that you used to have a phobia of spiders and you went to therapy and you got rid of your phobia of spiders, and so now you're no longer afraid of spiders. Well, let's say one day you're doing the dishes and out of nowhere a spider jumps out at you, okay? And you become afraid and you become very startled, and then all of a sudden you find yourself feeling jumpy around spiders again, okay? That's spontaneous recovery. This is when you start to have the association come back again, okay? So that's classical conditioning. So do we have any questions regarding classical conditionings? We'll just take a minute.
If you have any questions, just click on the bubble that looks like a chat message and type in your question, and we will address them. And even if you have questions going along, we'll address them at a stopping point. So go ahead and type them in.
Right, so the neutral stimulus becomes a conditioned stimulus. That's correct. Thank you, Ellen.
Professor Bruton, I sent you an email.
Okay, thank you, Alicia. Okay, thank you, Alicia.
Okay, there's a question. Can you explain better on the difference between stimulus extinction and stimulus discrimination?
Okay, so stimulus extinction and stimulus discrimination?
Correct. They want to know the difference between stimulus extinction and stimulus discrimination.
Okay, so stimulus discrimination, that is what happens when you only respond to a particular stimulus in a particular way. So if little Albert had only been afraid of white rats and was not afraid of anything else white or fluffy, but only to the white rat, that's stimulus discrimination. Whereas extinction would be if little Albert was no longer afraid of white rats, if the fear went away. So does that help? Does that make things a little bit more clear?
Okay, there's another question. Is there a specific time after which we consider a patient having spontaneous recovery?
That depends on the patient. I would say, I mean, I'm not a clinician, okay? So I imagine that, that could depend on the person. That could depend also on the person's stress level. Of course, stress can trigger many other different associations that could cause somebody to be more sensitive possibly to spontaneous recovery. If they were, for example, we have this public health crisis going on, and if they see something that reminds them of an old phobia, it's possible that, their phobia could start again in spontaneous recovery. But then again, I'm not a clinician, so.
I would just further extend the question. I got to know that it's we cannot predict the time exactly, but why does the definition of the word or the word says spontaneous recovery? It is not exactly a recovery. It is like coming back of the problem, is it?
Right. So the thing is, you have to remember with psychology, that's a very good question. You have to remember with psychology, a lot of these terms, they don't mean the same thing as they do in everyday language. So recovery in this context doesn't mean getting better. Recovery in this context means it's coming back.
Okay.
Can I add something?
Sure, go ahead.
Add something to that. I use the example of like if you have a pet and you feed them canned wet food and they're used to hearing the can opener, and even if you're opening a can of soup or a can of tuna, that they'll come in and they think they're being fed. And after the, evolution of pop top cans, they no longer hear the can opener when they're being fed. However, There may be a point in time that passes, or maybe you go to the grocery store and you buy different canned food and now you have to use the can opener again. They don't require any more training to respond to that can opener in the food. As soon as they hear that can opener again, it's automatic that they know, hey, I'm being fed. There's no training that has to occur again to get them to react to pairing the can opener sound with them being fed. Does that make a little bit more sense? It's like immediate recovery of, hey, this is going to happen when I hear this. There's no more training that has to occur.
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah.
Okay.
So if there are no further questions, I'm going to go ahead and continue. And if you're just now joining us, could you please, oh, you're very welcome. Could you please mute your microphones? That's greatly appreciated. Thank you very much. Okay, I appreciate that. I appreciate everybody being out here during this time. So let's talk about operant conditioning now. So Skinner. Okay, so B.F. Skinner, he was the one who came up with operant conditioning. He observed mainly with his research with pigeons. He also did rats, research with rats, but he also mainly did research with pigeons. And he was actually training pigeons to guide missiles back before they had, advanced computers. Okay. So please don't try to annotate the meeting. I appreciate that. Thank you. Okay, so operant conditioning, this is where behavior is changed based on the consequences of the behavior. So if I'm a student in the classroom and I answer the question and the professor is very warm and kind and smiles and says, oh, thank you for your great question or great question, more than likely I'm going to want to ask another question because I got a really nice response. Okay, so operant conditioning is conditioning where your behavior changes based on the consequences of your behavior. So I'm going to talk about reinforcement before I talk about reinforcer, because this might be easier for people to conceptualize this reinforcement reinforcer rather, if they think of reinforcement. So reinforcement is a process. Reinforcement is a process by which the behavior increases as a result of a consequence. Excuse me. So a reinforcement is a process. So for example, I am training my dog. I tell my dog to sit. The dog sits. I give the treat. The dog is more likely to sit when I tell the dog to sit. Okay. So reinforcement always increases the likelihood of a behavior. Okay, so reinforcement always causes a behavior to increase. Okay, a reinforcer is the agent. Okay, the agent that is something that causes, that is the consequence that the person likes. Okay, so for example, if I take out the garbage and I'm praised for that, the praise is a reinforcer, okay? Or if I'm playing with the dog and I give the dog a treat and the dog is more likely to sit after giving the treat, that treat is a reinforcer, okay? So the reinforcer is the pleasant consequence, okay? The reinforcer is that pleasant consequence, okay? And so that's reinforcer. So there are two types of reinforcers. There's primary reinforcers, and then there are secondary reinforcers, okay? The primary reinforcer, that is, it's a type of pleasant consequence where it fulfills some sort of innate need. Okay, so anything that's food, anything that's a treat, or if you have been going without water and you're given water, okay, that is a primary reinforcer, okay? A secondary reinforcer, these are reinforcers that are not innately satisfying. These are things like tokens, these are like gold stars, money, things that in of themselves don't fulfill an innate need. So money does not, by itself, does not fulfill an innate need. You can't eat money. But with money, you can buy food, you can buy treats, you can buy water, you can buy access to a safe place to sleep. Okay, so a secondary reinforcer is a consequence that does not in of itself fulfill an innate need, but it is something that you will work for, okay? So money is a very powerful primary reinforcer, okay? It is a very, very powerful primary reinforcer, okay? And what happens here sometimes is you can have generalization happen. So for example, and I like to use the example of a dog begging for food, okay? So you have the dog begging for food at the table. The dog has learned that if it begs, it'll get food, okay? It might not get food every time, but at some point, if that dog keeps begging, that dog knows it's going to keep getting food. It's going to be able to get food at some point, so the dog keeps getting food, okay? So the behavior, begging at the table, is reinforced by getting food, okay? Getting the food is a reinforcer, okay? So what can happen is that even the dog has never been reinforced for begging at any other place. Let's say one day you go and you sit on your couch, it's nowhere near dinner time. You sit on your couch, you start eating your snack, a favorite snack, let's say it's chips or something like that. The dog has never ever begged at the couch before, but the dog comes and starts begging you for food at the couch. The dog thinks that it can be possibly reinforced for begging in a new situation. So the dog has generalized the behavior of begging from the kitchen table to you sitting on your couch, okay? So thank you for that question, shaping. I'll get to shaping in a moment, okay? And thank you, Laura McKnight, for answering that other question for me. Thank you as I go through this. So I'll get to shaping in a moment, Flack, thank you. So that's generalization. Extinction, however, one example I like to use for extinction is when a person is going to get a drink from a Coke machine, and the Coke machine does not give you your Coke. So you might have had this happen to you. So you put some money in the Coke machine and you expect a soda or some other drink to come out, okay? So you expect your behavior of putting in money to be reinforced by getting the drink that you want, okay? So what sometimes happens is those machines jam or they're out of order. And what will happen is that you will go try to get your drink, but no drink comes out. So you might see people do things like, push against it. Don't ever do it, okay? It's extremely dangerous to push against a Coke machine. Don't do this. But what you see there, people getting frustrated at something known as an extinction burst, okay? So this is a process where a person, or even an organism, this is seen in animals too, they get frustrated if they don't receive their reinforcer. And then eventually the person at the Coke machine realizes they're no longer going to get a soda out of this machine. They realize they're no longer going to get a reinforcer in this situation, okay? So the association between the behavior and the consequence becomes broken, and eventually the person stops, engaging in that behavior in that situation, okay? And while I'm talking about reinforcement, before I go into shaping, I want to talk about the difference between positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. I feel like this is very important to talk about because a lot of times students, they become confused about the words positive and negative. So remember I said earlier that in these psychology terms, a lot of times the words don't mean the same as they do in regular language, okay, in common vernacular. So positive in this context of reinforcement, positive reinforcement is when something is added. Okay, so remember, reinforcement is a process by which a consequence increases the likelihood of a behavior of occurring. So positive reinforcement means something that a person or animal likes is added. Okay. Negative reinforcement, this is when something a person or an animal does not like is taken away. So positive reinforcement, for example, would be getting a treat, being praised. So you're getting something that you like for engaging in a behavior. Okay. You're getting something that you like for engaging in a behavior. Okay. Negative reinforcement, an example of this would be you get into your car and the car starts, and you turn the car on without putting on your seatbelt, and the car starts buzzing. Okay, you put on your seatbelt, buzzing goes away. Okay, negative reinforcement is when something unpleasant is taken away. It gives you relief from that unpleasant thing. Okay, so negative reinforcement, something is taken away, something that you do not like is taken away. Another example of this is getting up in the morning and turning off your alarm clock. Okay, the behavior of you getting up and turning off your alarm clock is reinforced by the cessation of the annoying buzzing sound. Okay, or another example of this could be if you were locked, if you were put into a room and there's one doorway, one open door, and somebody electrified the grid on the floor and you get shocked, and so you run out of the room to escape the shock. Okay, your behavior of escaping the room is negatively reinforced by you no longer having to feel the shock. Okay, so I see a question about a tantrum. Okay, so is a kid, okay, thank you, Laura McKnight. Okay, so for answering that. But on the concept, on the about the tantrums. Okay, so with tantrums, both positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement can occur. Okay, so when a child throws a tantrum, and let's say the parent is very, very tired, and the parent's like, okay, here, okay, and gives into the child is receiving what they want for throwing the tantrum. So they are getting something. So for the child, getting what they want is positive reinforcement for throwing the tantrum. For the parent, on the other hand, the parent is being reinforced also. The parent is giving into the child, giving the child what they want, and as a result of giving into the child, the tantrum stops. So they are so the parent is negatively reinforced by the tantrum going away. Okay, so it's something that this is how tantrums can sort of go in a cycle. Okay, so thank you for that, but that's not an original example. This is an example that gets seen every day in supermarkets, and I'm not blaming the parents. Believe me, I know parenting's a hard job. So shaping, okay? Shaping is a process by which a behavior, usually it's a very complex behavior, like if you've ever seen a dog jump through a series of obstacle courses and things like that. This is where a target behavior is reinforced through its successive approximations. So what are successive approximations? Successive approximations are behaviors that look like the target behavior. So for example, you might have seen those videos of the cat ringing the bell, okay? So, cute little cat ringing the bell. So cats don't naturally, they're not born knowing how to ring bells, okay? So they might play with a bell, okay, but they don't know how to, they don't have an instinct to ring bells for treats, okay? So the way a cat might be trained to ring a bell is through successive approximation. So the first successive approximation, the cat puts, their paw on the bell, they get a treat, okay, just touching the bell. And then and once the cat's regularly touching the bell, then the cat might be reinforced for get a treat for touching closer to the top, and then get reinforced for touching the button. And then finally only being reinforced for pushing down on the button and ringing the bell, okay? So that is an example of shaping. Okay, so you have a target behavior like ringing a bell for treats, and to get there, you reinforce behaviors that look like something closer and closer, more and more similar to the target behavior until the animal is engaging the target behavior. So you can kind of think of when you were learning to write, how you were reinforced for writing something kind of squiggly, and then as you got better, you were only reinforced for, you know, maintaining that level of writing quality. Okay, so you can kind of think back to how humans are shaped. Okay, so you can kind of thinking, you know, learning to write as an example. Okay, so let's talk about punishment. Okay, so punishment, this is something that as a society we're very familiar with. And so punishment can be effective, but it's mainly effective when it is administered in a, you know, by a person who's respected. So if an adult that you don't respect at all is telling you to do something or threatening a punishment, you're gonna be like, yeah, whatever. Okay. So for punishment to be effective, it has to be administered by a respected person. It has to be consistent. It has to be immediate and appropriate. Okay. So it's got to be consistent, immediate, administered by a respected person, appropriate, and also it needs to be combined with reinforcement. So for example, you might have a dog chewing on a shoe. You don't want the dog to chew on the shoe, so you might kind of, you know, have, you know, shout a sharp no at them. Okay, and then at the same time, give them a chew toy to chew on. When they chew on the chew toy, praise them, because most dogs are not talented enough to chew on a shoe and a excuse me, chew on a shoe and a bone at the same time. So you reinforce a behavior that's incompatible for the behavior you don't want. Okay, so for punishment is, as you know, it's anything that is any consequence that decreases the likelihood of a behavior. Okay, so punishment always decreases. Okay, reinforcement always increases behavior. Punishment always decreases it. Okay, so punishment by application, this is where if you do something and you're punished, this is you receive something you don't like. Okay, so as a kid, you might have received a spanking, or you might, as an adult, you might receive a verbal reprimand, okay, from your boss. Okay, you get something you don't like, or a traffic ticket if you're caught speeding. Okay, punished by removal or negative punishment. Again, something is being taken away. So this would be something like removing privileges. So this might be an example of your parents grounding you and saying, you know, you can't use a car, you can't use the internet, you are taking away something that you like to punish you. Okay, so this is like taking away privileges and things like that. Okay, so these principles can be used to modify behavior. So behavioral modification. So behavior modification is just using the principles of behavior to change someone's behavior. And this is used in therapy sessions. This is used in schools and sometimes even used in prisons, in some prisons. And one of those things that are used in behavioral modification is a token economy. And so this is when, for example, a secondary reinforcer is administered for doing desirable behavior. So sometimes in some, psychiatric hospitals, if people are staying for long term, a person might be given tokens for doing things that they need to be doing or speaking up during therapy sessions and things like that. And they can then turn in these tokens for things that they like. Okay. And finally, observational learning and mirror neurons. Okay. So this is Bandura. Okay. Okay. So this is Bandura. Bandura was the one who did the Bobo doll study. So please review the Bobo doll study. And so Bandura, he identified observational learning. And observational learning is a type of learning where an organism learns by watching another organism. Okay. And I'll explain token economy again in a moment. Thank you. But observational learning, this is where somebody learns by observing another. Okay. So in that Bobo doll study, when the kids were, put into two groups. One group of kids watched a video of an adult playing with toys peacefully. The other group of kids, watched an adult beat up on a Bobo doll. Okay, and this is kind of a blew up clown doll. The kids who watched the adult play with the beat up Bobo doll, they were more likely to beat up on the Bobo doll because they watched an adult do this. Okay. And so the thing is, this is done through mirror neurons. Okay, so as humans, and also in some other animals that are, social, but we have what are called mirror neurons. And these mirror neurons are neurons that fire in our brains as if we were the ones doing the behavior. So for example, if I'm learning how to play basketball and I'm watching someone play basketball and I'm watching them closely, my neurons in my brain are firing as if I'm the one doing the moves. And this gets me ready to imitate them and imitate them more effectively. Okay. So that's observational learning and mirror neurons. Okay. So going back to the token economy. So the token, I'll just go back to it very quickly. So the token economy, for example, let's say that somebody is in a rehab program, like a drug rehab program. Not all drug rehab programs do this, but some might. So for example, a person is given a set of tasks that they need to do during the day. So they need to make their bed, they need to, keep up their hygiene and things like that. They need to go to their meetings and things like that. So I'm talking about like an inpatient rehab facility. And so whenever the person, they engage in the behavior they're supposed to do. So whenever they make their bed or they, keep up their appearance, like by brushing their hair, washing their face, things, basic hygiene like that, and then going to their therapy meetings and speaking up during therapy meetings, they might get a token. So for example, this could be anything like a gold star or sticker or, usually some kind of like fake coin. And then later on, this person can trade these coins or whatever for, more recreational time, more phone time, more TV time, things like that. Okay. Yes, thank you, Laura McKnight, a juvenile detention center. Okay, they had to earn points to be released. Absolutely. Okay. Yeah. They would earn points to be able to earn privileges to watch TV, play video games, and everything. Okay. Oh, and golden stars. That's fantastic, Javier. Thank you. Yeah, the golden stars is a fantastic example of a token economy. Very, very good examples. Very, very good examples. Right. And Laura and Professor McKnight says, each week, going back to the juvenile detention facility, they would earn points to be able to earn privileges to watch TV, play video games, play basketball, get a furlough, go home for the weekend. Okay, so what I'm going to go ahead and do is go to memory. Okay, and so in King, it's chapter 7. It might be different. Okay, might be different. Okay, so mirror neurons, just really quick, one more before I move on. Thank you. So mirror neuron, this is where your you have the neurons that fire. You're watching somebody engage in a behavior that you're learning. These neurons fire as if you were the one engaging in the behavior. Okay, so they're called mirror neurons. So in your brain, these neurons are mirroring what someone else is doing, so to get you ready to be able to imitate that behavior. Okay. So I'm going to go, I know I'm going fast. I'm trying to go faster, but I'm going to go ahead and go into memory because we've got a lot of stuff in memory to cover. So I'm going to go ahead, and I apologize, but we're going to go ahead and start into memory. So in King, memory is chapter 7. That might be different in the textbook that you might be assigned by your instructor. So let's go ahead and talk about memory. So one of those things about memory that we want to be sure that we talk about, and also sometimes in these handbooks that are available, you have addendums, okay? Okay, you want to check out these addendums to make sure that you don't miss anything here, okay? And these addendums are there so that everybody gets the same objectives to learn, okay? So be sure you check out the addendums in your final exam handbook. So One thing to know about memory, okay, is I always like to start off with this, is that memory is reconstructive. A lot of people think that your memory acts like a video recording. It's not, okay? And so what happens is different pieces of memory, so the audio part, the visual part, olfactory, all of those different parts of the memory, they're stored in different parts of the brain. And then when you recall something, when you remember something, it has to be remembered in pieces. And so the brain has to put all those pieces back together. And sometimes those pieces don't come together exactly as things happened. Okay. So the thing with eyewitness accounts, unfortunately, they're not always accurate. So eyewitness accounts, this is when people will see, for example, a crime occur, and then they'll be questioned about the crime. And a lot of times with investigators, they'll talk to several different people in that crowd who witnessed a crime, and they'll be asked, well, can you please, you know, identify the perpetrator, or can you please describe the perpetrator? They'll give different descriptions of the same person, okay? And so that's why a lot of times when they're doing police lineups and the detective has to say, do you recognize anybody? Okay, they don't say, do you recognize the suspect? Because that can activate people's biases about what they think a suspect looks like, okay? Because your memory, the way you recall memory, it is reconstructive, and it is very sensitive to biases and interference and all kinds of things that we're going to be talking about, okay? So one approach that you'll hear about in memory is the information processing approach. This says that your brain, or your mind rather, operates like a computer. So you can kind of think of your brain as a hardware. That's the physical stuff, the stuff that you could touch, okay? So like on a computer, you have the hardware, you have the motherboard, you have the hard drive, you have the input devices like your keyboard, and you have your camera and things like webcam and all of that, okay? So your brain is your hardware, your software is your mind. So all of your thoughts, your feelings, your memories, that's like the software, okay? And you have input, processing, and output just like a computer. So our input devices, there are senses, so our eyes, our ears, our nose, mouth, touch. You know, that's where we take in stimuli. Our mind, our brain processes it. And then the output is our behavior, okay? And that in behavior includes speech, okay? So your actions and your words, okay? So the words that you are hearing me, these are the output, okay? These are the output, okay? You can kind of think of my brain as a computer, okay? And that's what the information processing approach says, that we have input, processing, and output, okay? And so what we have encoding, storage, and retrieval. So encoding, so this is when information is being put into memory, okay? So for example, let's say that you're working on a research paper, and you save that research paper, the computer is saving that research paper to your hard drive, okay, so that you can get it later. So whenever you are making a new memory, that's called encoding. That means information is being put into memory, into your long-term memory, so that you can recall it again, okay? Storage, this is where information is being held in storage, okay? So even if you're not thinking of all of your memories right now, if you could think of all of your memories at once, you'd be completely overwhelmed, but it's sitting in storage. You can kind of think of your mind as a library or a vast array of file cabinets, or I like to use hard drive, okay, like a computer, and information sitting on your hard drive, even though you're not always using it, that information is sitting on there in storage, okay? And retrieval, this is like when you open a file on your computer. So in your mind, when you remember something, so for example, you're taking an exam and you recognize the answer, or you remember the answer to a question, you retrieve that information out of your long-term memory, okay? So your long-term memory, okay, so the long-term memory, this is the memory that is, and I'll get to short-term memory in a moment, but your long-term memory, when we're talking about encoding, storage, and retrieval, we're talking about mainly about long-term memory. Your long-term memory is like your hard drive. This is, except for humans, it's virtually limitless. And the main reason we forget things is because we don't, like sometimes we don't organize things very well in our minds, okay? Short-term memory, okay? This is a short-term memory process. So what happens, short-term memory storage, okay, that's very temporary. So here's what happens, okay? And let me use the example of like going about your day, okay? And so you're walking a path, okay, to go to work, okay, and or go to school, and you're walking along, and there's a fire hydrant, okay? Let's say there's a new fire hydrant that's been put into the sidewalk, the route you usually take. First of all, as far as your brain is concerned, if you don't pay attention to that fire hydrant, it doesn't exist. So first you have to pay attention to something, okay? And then you pay attention to it, it goes into sensory memory. Sensory memory is very, very, very brief memory that allows your brain to just enough time to start processing it. And so from sensory memory, it goes into short-term memory. Short-term memory is roughly 30 seconds long, and you can remember 7 plus or minus 2 items, okay? 7, and I'm going to put this in a chat, 7 plus or minus 2 items. So that's about between 5 to 9 items, okay? And so that is your short-term memory, is your memory storage. So you can store 7 plus or minus 2 items, or store something there for about 30 seconds. Your working memory, that is a process that handles the information that is being held in the short-term memory. Your working memory is also responsible for deciding what's important to take out of long-term memory. So you can kind of think of somebody, sitting at their computer, working on their computer. The user is the working memory, okay? You can think of the user working the computer as a working memory. What's open currently on the desktop is being stored in short-term memory. Anything that gets saved to the hard drive, that's like long-term memory, okay? So here's a question. So encoding is adding new information, and retrieval is old or already stored in memory. So right, so encoding is when you add something to long-term, when you add information to long-term memory, and retrieval is when you take something out of storage, okay? You take out an already stored memory, that is correct. So short-term memory, that's temporary memory storage. Working memory works with the information that is in short-term memory. And so if the working memory makes a decision, okay, this information is important enough that we need to remember this later, it encodes it into the long-term memory, okay? Long-term memory is virtually limitless, and it's virtually infinite. But the thing is, a lot of times we forget because we don't really organize things well, okay? So there are different types of long-term memory. There's declarative memory. Declarative memory is memory that you can talk about, okay? So this is any kind of memory that's, memory for facts or events, okay? So to declare, okay? You're declaring something, you're speaking something. So if you can speak about it easily, that's declarative memory. So any information that you remember, okay, from, like, for example, historical information from your classes, if you're taking a history class, or anything kind of event. So facts is semantic memory, okay? So remembering the structure of a water molecule, that's semantic memory, okay? Or remembering all of the different parts of the brain, that's semantic memory, okay? Or knowing what the different parts of the brain do, that's semantic memory. Those are facts. Episodic memory is memory for things like events, okay? Yes, thank you, Laura. So retrieval, going into your phone and text and call that person. Very good, thank you. So episodic memory, that's memory for episodes, okay? That is memory for events. I'm sorry?
I'm having a hard time typing my question.
Oh, no, it's okay. But go ahead and please try to type in your question. I appreciate it. Thank you. Please take your time. So an example of an episodic memory is remembering what happened on your 16th birthday. Okay, so that's usually episodic memories or things from your own personal life. Non-declarative memory, okay, non-declarative memory is memory for things that you can't easily talk about. So things that are procedural, okay, procedural memory is your memory like muscle memory, your memory for how to perform actions like tying a shoe, riding a bike, swimming. So think of it this way. Have you ever tried to sit someone down and just tell them how to ride a bike without showing them? That's pretty hard to do, right? Okay, so that's procedural memory. Okay, same thing with tying your shoes. You know, you can't just sit and tell somebody how to tie your shoes, you have to show them. Another example of non-declarative memory is things like classical conditioning, okay, and things of that nature, and also priming. Okay, and so as far as retrieving something from long-term memory, okay, you have recall and recognition. Okay, you have recall and recognition. Recall, this is where you have to remember the information all by yourself, okay? So for example, you can think of something like an essay exam where you have to pretty much talk about everything you know about a topic, okay? That's recall. In fact, that's known as free recall. Cued recall, that is when you have a cue, so like fill in the blank, things of that nature, okay? Recognition, this is where you just have to recognize the item to be remembered. So for example, a multiple choice test, okay? A multiple choice test, that is where you have to just recognize the correct answer. So the correct answer is right there in front of you. You just have to recognize it, okay? So semantic memory, okay? Again, semantic memory, that is memories for facts. Okay, so things like historical facts you might learn in history class, or you know, what the different parts of the brain do. Okay, so that's memory for facts and figures and things of that nature. Okay, so that's semantic memory. The difference between recall and recognition: recall, that is when you have to remember everything on your own. Okay, and sometimes you get a cue, but you have to provide the answer. So you can kind of think of a fill in the blank question, that's like cued recall, or free recall, that's like a, you know, a free response question, like an essay question. So you have to actually remember the information. Recognition, this is where the answer is right in front of you. You just have to recognize it. You just have to see and say, ah, that's the right answer right there. Okay, it's like a multiple choice exam. Exactly. So there are different reasons for us forgetting, okay? And so even though long-term memory is virtually limitless, okay, even though it's virtually limitless, sometimes we have issues with remembering. So sometimes we have what is known as something known as, you know, encoding failure. This means that for whatever reason, it never got into memory to begin with. So for example, what a real penny looks like. So where pennies are so common that we don't really need to bother to learn about what a real penny looks like, okay? So if somebody were to show you a set of pennies that look different and somebody were to ask you which is a real penny, most of us wouldn't be able to recognize a real penny because we never bothered to memorize what a real penny looks like. So, you know, if you don't learn something or you don't memorize something and you don't remember it later, that's encoding failure, okay? How short-term memory can be increased. I'll be getting to that in a moment, Ellen. Thank you. Thank you very much for the question. So that's encoding failure. Decay theory. This means that what happens is, excuse me, a chemical, when you learn something, a chemical trace forms, and then over time it fades. So for example, if you go to class and you don't take notes and you listen to the instructor, okay, what happens is that if you don't practice that information, that information is going to fade and it's going to get harder and harder for you to remember it, okay? So you have to rehearse information, okay, in order for it to really get in there and kind of tell your brain, okay, this information is important. We need to remember this, okay? Interference theory, okay, so different pieces of information can interfere with each other. So for example, information that you learn later can interfere with information that you learned earlier, and information you learned earlier can interfere with information that you learned later, okay? Motivated forgetting. Motivated forgetting, this is somewhat Freudian. This is where you tell yourself or try to make yourself forget something. For example, let's say you're giving a presentation in class and you stumble over your words and you're so embarrassed and you try to push it out of your mind, okay? That's motivated forgetting. Retrieval failure, this is sort of like a tip of the tongue phenomenon. So if you were ever playing a trivia game and you know the answer to a question, you're like, oh, I know it, I know it, I know it. The information is there, but for whatever reason, you can't retrieve it. Okay, so that's retrieval failure. So the information is in there, is in long-term memory, but you can't retrieve it. Okay, so how can short-term memory be increased? Okay, so short-term memory could be increased through many things. Okay, we'll get to schema in a moment, but one way to increase short-term memory is through something known as chunking. So chunking is when you group pieces of information together. So for example, a phone number, if you ever looked at a phone number, or if you've ever looked at your social security number and seen how the numbers are grouped together, that is so that you just remember the number groups and not the individual numbers. So that's an example of of chunking, okay? So the two types of interference, okay? So interference, the two types of interference, there's there's retrograde and interograde. Interograde is, interference that moves into the future. So earlier information interferes with information learned later. Retrograde interference, that is when information learned later interferes with information learned earlier. And motivated forgetting, this is basically when you try to make yourself forget something because it's embarrassing or upsetting to you. Okay? So a schema. Okay, so remember earlier that I said that our biases affect the way that we remember things. So a schema, that is a mental framework. So we all have our basic ideas about the way we think things should be, okay? Now, the most common way to think about a schema is to think about a stereotype, okay? So people have stereotypes about different types of people and other things, okay? Stereotypes are an example of a schema, in fact, a destructive type of schema. But a lot of our schemas are more benign. So a lot of people have an idea of what a dog is supposed to look like, what they believe a house is supposed to look like, or what they believe a classroom is supposed to be like. So it's kind of like a blueprint or a script for how you expect things to go. And these expectations or mental frameworks, they will affect the way you remember things. And so if you have a schema or a mental framework, like a set of characteristics that you would expect a criminal to have, particularly if you have expectations of certain physical characteristics and the type of clothes and whatnot a criminal might have, then that schema can affect the way you remember a crime, okay? So that is why during police lineups, a detective will have to say, do you recognize anybody? They don't say, do you recognize a criminal? Because that activates your schema for criminal, okay? So let's go on to ways of improving memory. So mnemonics, this is where you use different sayings and things, and also, anagrams and acronyms for remembering different things. So please excuse my dear Aunt Sally, okay, for the order of operations, okay, for math. So that's an example of a mnemonic device or mnemonics, okay. And also back in the day for, the planets, my very educated mother just baked us 9 pizza pies, okay, back when Pluto was still considered a planet. Elaborative rehearsal, elaboration. This is where you, when you're learning a concept, you link other concepts to the concept that you're learning. So for example, you're learning about reinforcement, so you link reinforcement to reinforcers, giving a dog a treat, things like that. So you kind of create a web, a concept web of that concept. Self-references, this is where you relate the information to yourself, okay? This is where you relate the information to yourself. So you read the content and try to apply it and think about, how does this apply to me? So I use the example of my dog sitting for a treat. I'm referencing, self-referencing reinforcement. Visual imagery, this is where you picture in your mind what a concept would look like, okay? Also, you could also use an example of, think about, memorize the different rooms in a house and associate different concepts with the different rooms in the house and kind of have a visual representation of different concepts. Organization, okay, so this is where you organize information in a logical way. So for example, if your clothes closet is real messy, you can't find your shoes even though your shoes are there. But if your clothes closet is organized, you can find your shoes better, okay? Overlearning, this is where you learn something so much you get sick of it and you keep learning, okay? You get so tired of it, you want to throw your book across the room, but you keep learning it, okay? That's overlearning. Mass practice, this is cramming. Don't do this, guys, okay, everybody, okay? Excuse me. So mass practice, this is where you cram. This is where you try to learn everything at once. Don't do it. Don't do it. Okay, it's not good. And I'm guilty of that back when I was in college, but it's not good, because what happens is, even if you ace the test, when the test is over, all the information goes away. Okay, what's better is something known as spaced practice or distributed practice. So this is when you do a little bit of studying at a time over a long period of time. So for example, studying a little bit every day, okay? So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go down to the addendum, scroll down to the addendum for memory, okay? So mnemonic devices, okay? So we talked about strategies that can improve memory. So things like, please excuse my dear Aunt Sally, overlearning, we talked about that, mass practice, spaced or distributed practice, okay? We talked about these things. Also, we need to talk about dementia and Alzheimer's disease. So dementia, this is where you have neurocognitive disorders. This is what happens over time. You know, in some cases, in some older adults, they might have declining memory function. They also might have declining intellectual function in some cases. So there are different types of dementia. Dementia is just an umbrella term for those different conditions. Alzheimer's disease is a type of dementia that is categorized by memory loss as the first symptom to be noticed. So in Alzheimer's disease, what's happening is that you have these misshapen proteins, okay, called tau proteins, and they have these bundles of these proteins that are called tangles, okay? And these tangles, they cause these amyloid plaques or scar-like tissue, and the brain can't recover from the damage, and so you have progressive brain damage. And what happens at first is the person starts to lose their memory, and I'm talking memory for things like not just where are my car keys, it's what are car keys for, okay? Or not just remembering someone's birth, not just, you know, forgetting someone's birthday, but just forgetting who their spouse is. Okay, so that's the kind of memory loss associated with Alzheimer's disease. And eventually, unfortunately, a person stops being able to feed themselves, take care of themselves, and then unfortunately, a person does die of Alzheimer's disease. Okay, Alzheimer's is not a normal part of aging. So this Alzheimer's disease has many different possible causes, you know, things like lifestyle is correlated with Alzheimer's disease. So if someone lives a healthy lifestyle, they're less likely to develop it. Also, there's a strong genetic component, and there's also more research every day being done on Alzheimer's disease. So that's memory. I'm going to take a quick break, really quick. So if they have any questions, please type them in the chat, and I'm going to mute myself for a couple moments. So if anybody has any questions, please type them in the chat. Thank you very much. And we will get started next with lifespan development. Thank you. Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you. So I'll go ahead and answer some questions. So go over the token economy. I'm afraid I really can't go over token economy at the moment. I apologize. I really can't go back and reteach everything, but this will be recorded. And when that recording becomes available, it will be distributed out to the instructors.
Kate, Denise informed me that we can go ahead and post this recording and the information on the psychology department website. So it will be available tomorrow for everyone to access on the same website where all the resources are available for the final exam, which is the same link where they got the final exam handbook.
Fantastic. That's great. That is fantastic. All right. Thank you.
And also for those of you asking questions of things that we already covered or things that you want to kind of go back over and review, just notate the time. We started recording at 6:30 p.m. So just know that we're almost 2 hours in. And so you just have to fast forward 2 hours into the recording to be able to kind of review what you may have missed or go back over it.
All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to start talking about lifespan development. I'm just going to get a quick drink of water. Just very quick. And we're going to go ahead and move on forward to lifespan development. I apologize, I'm unable to get to everybody's questions. Again, this session will be recorded. So let's go ahead and start with lifespan development. So you have two types of designs that are primarily for studying across the lifespan, okay? And we talk about lifespan development, we're talking about how organisms, particularly people, how they change over the course of time, okay? So development is about change, and that takes time. So cross-sectional designs and longitudinal designs are different. So Dr. Pasha Zaidi, she, was one of the speakers towards the beginning. She was the speaker towards the beginning of this session. She talked about the longitudinal design. So you see that root word long, it takes a really long time. So this is where you have a single group of participants, usually around the same age. So that's called a cohort. So people around the same age are called a cohort. And this group of people is measured multiple times over a course of time. Okay, so for example, if you wanted to see how math ability develops over time, you might get a group of 3-year-olds and then give them an age appropriate math test, and then test them again when they are 5 years old, then again when they're 8, then again when they're 10, 13, 16, on and on and on. And so you can one way you can think about this is sort of like if you had class pictures, so you had a picture of your class in kindergarten, in your first grade class, and usually it's the same group of people, okay? And some people come and go, but over time, if you look at all your class pictures, you can see pretty much almost the same group of people, but having pictures taken of them over multiple periods of time, okay? Over a long period of time, okay? So it can take a long time. Some of these longitudinal designs, they can take 30 years, okay? And the cross-sectional design, this is sort of like a cross-section. So if you ever seen like a cross-section of a diagram of the brain, that's where you can see everything at once, almost everything at once. So this is where you have a group of people, like a sample of people, and you have different ages of people in this sample. So you can kind of think of like a family photo. You have different age people, and you take a picture of them at one time, in one point in time. And so that's a cross-sectional design, okay? So that's longitudinal and cross-sectional design. So let's talk about, now go on to prenatal development. So we're going to talk about the zygote. So what happens is when, during conception, when the sperm and egg meet, you have what is called the zygote. The zygote is essentially this fertilized egg, okay? So the zygote, what happens with the zygote is that as the zygote is, after you have the zygote, the fertilized egg, that zygote the cells divide, okay? It divides into 2, then the 4, then into 8, and on and on and on, okay? This period where the cell is dividing and going down the fallopian tube and into the uterus and implanting into the uterus, this is the germinal period, and it takes roughly 10 to 14 days around that time, okay? And so that is the amount of time it takes in between fertilization and implantation. And so once implantation occurs, you have what is known as the embryonic period. Okay? And this embryonic period is the period that takes place after implantation. And what happens during the embryonic period is that this is where the major organs start to form. So this is when the heart starts to form. This is when the digestive system starts to form, the brain, and the things like that. And at the very start of the embryonic period, you have what is known as a primitive streak. This primitive streak then becomes the neural tube, which then becomes the spinal cord in the brain, okay? And so during the embryonic period, you have the organs that are being formed, the major organs, the brain being formed towards the end of the embryonic period. You have the face starts to take shape, the limbs start to take shape, and it lasts from 2 weeks after conception until about 8 weeks after conception, okay? And so the 8th week of pregnancy is the end of the embryonic period. Now, during the embryonic period, this individual, okay, this organism, okay, is extremely sensitive to agents known as teratogens. A teratogen is any agent that could affect prenatal development. So a teratogen could be anything like alcohol, lead, cigarette smoke, any environmental toxin, some medications. This is why doctors will advise people who are pregnant to be careful of the kind of medications they're taking, some types of foods, okay? So mercury in fish, okay? So doctors will advise people who are pregnant to be careful of their fish intake, or, where the fish are sourced, because mercury can affect the embryo. So one effect of teratogens, okay, is fetal alcohol spectrum syndrome, okay? And so what happens is that when a person who is pregnant takes in alcohol and they drink alcohol, there is a increased risk of damage to the embryo, okay? And the earlier a teratogen is introduced, the more critical the damage is going to be. The more likely it's going to damage a major organ or the nervous system. And what happens with fetal alcohol syndrome is that you have a embryo that's been exposed to alcohol, and it's called the spectrum because the severity of the symptoms run on the spectrum. Sometimes these symptoms might be barely noticeable, or they might be very, very noticeable and very severe. So usually in fetal alcohol spectrum syndrome, you'll see a person where, they might, the face, looks a little bit different. Okay, the face, the ears might be a little bit lower, the limbs might be malformed, and unfortunately, what comes with this is intellectual disabilities and also behavioral issues. And in some more extreme cases, a child can suffer from seizures. Okay. And so that's fetal alcohol syndrome, and that's usually that's from the effects of alcohol being consumed during pregnancy, and alcohol is a teratogen or an agent that can affect prenatal development, okay? So the embryonic period lasts again from 2 weeks after conception until 8 weeks after conception. Then after 8 weeks, you have what is known as the fetal period. The fetal period lasts from about 8 weeks after conception or 9 weeks after conception until birth, okay? And during the fetal period, this is when, you know, the limbs start to take more of a defined shape. This is when the organs mature. And, you know, some other organs start to form here as well, okay? But the major organs mature enough so that the baby can survive outside the womb, okay? And so the point of the fetal period is to get the individual ready to survive outside the womb after birth. And so during the fetal period, this is when a doctor or another person can hear the baby's heartbeat, okay, hear the fetal heartbeat, can, you know, and the person who's pregnant, they'll, you know, they'll feel the fetal movements, okay? This is also when hearing starts to become, you know, starts to form. So at birth, hearing is the most sensitive sense because the fetus is hearing sounds from outside the womb, okay? So in malnutrition, yeah, failure to thrive. So malnutrition can have a detrimental effect on prenatal development, absolutely. But that's what the fetal period is. This is where the maturation of the organs. This is also when this, you know, sense of hearing starts to really develop. This is, you know, when the face and arms become more defined, the limbs become more deformed. This is more formed, more defined, excuse my slip there. And this is also when, you know, hair and teeth start to form and things like that, okay? So that's the fetal period. So let's move on to attachment, okay? So attachment is very important, okay? So it's the close emotional bond between the infant and the caregiver. And infants require contact comfort, okay? So you might remember Harlow's studies with the monkeys, with the cloth mother versus the wire mother, and the baby monkeys stayed close to the cloth mother, even though the wire mother had the food, because, you know, babies, you know, need comfort, okay? Just like they need shelter and calories, they also need loving comfort. And if a baby is never touched, if a baby is never hugged, they will develop something known as failure to thrive, where they will actually be slower in their development, okay? And so as babies form attachments with their caregivers, they start to build that bond. And babies between 5 or 6 months will show something known as separation anxiety and stranger anxiety around that time. And so this is normal. So when, you know, the caregiver leaves the room and the baby starts to cry, that's normal, okay? This is actually an adaptation, okay? This helps babies survive and stay safe by staying with the caregiver, okay? So babies are naturally afraid when separated from their caregiver, and babies are naturally wary of strangers, okay? They're naturally wary of strangers. So if you ever, see a baby when they're born, like maybe one of your little cousins, and then like you see them when they're a newborn, and then when you see them when they're 9 months old and they don't trust you, that is because they don't recognize you and they see you as a stranger, okay? So Mary Ainsworth, she studied attachment, and she identified, she identified 4 main types of attachment. So secure attachment, this is where, an infant, they will, so for example, okay, let me go back a little bit. So Mary Ainsworth had what is known as the strange situation test. This is where she essentially took an infant, so it's usually the infant and the mother. And so the mother brought the infant into a room with a lot of toys. The infant would play with some of the different toys, and then the mother would leave the room. And then a stranger might come in, okay? And then the mother would return. And so Ainsworth was looking at how the baby interacts with the environment, how the baby reacts to a stranger coming, how the baby reacts to the mother leaving, and how the baby reacts to the mother returning. In a securely attached infant, this is when a infant will feel safe to explore an environment because they use the caregiver as a safe base, okay? And they feel safe around the caregiver. They are naturally wary of strangers, and they'll go to the caregiver for safety. If the caregiver leaves, and so in the case of the studies, the mother, they'll show distress, and when the mother returns, they're immediately calmed, okay, because they see the caregiver as a place of safety. And anxious ambivalent babies who are anxious ambivalent, they are fearful, they're nervous, they're afraid to explore, they might be very clingy to the caregiver. And when the caregiver leaves, they'll become very, very distressed. And when the caregiver returns, it'll take a while for them to calm down. Okay. And they might even, hit the caregiver, like, I love you, but I hate you for leaving, but I love you that you came back. Okay. So they're very extreme distress when the caregiver leaves, and they take a while to calm down when the caregiver returns. And they're very clingy, and they're fearful, and they're anxious. Okay. Avoidant, sometimes people confuse avoidant and anxious. Avoidant, this is kind of like where the infant sort of ignores the caregiver. So the infant will seem to ignore the caregiver when, being in the new room with the toys. And then when the caregiver leaves, they might not show a whole lot of distress. It's almost kind of like, whatever. And then when the caregiver returns, they don't show a whole lot of emotion either. So they seem to be avoiding the caregiver. Okay. Disorganized, this just means that the infant does not have a consistent way of coping. This is where an infant, where they might show up to the situation looking like avoidant, where they seem to ignore their mother or their caregiver. And when the caregiver leaves, they might become extremely distressed and throw things and cry and things of that nature. And then when the caregiver returns, they might continue to scream and cry, throw things, and show very, very, very extreme distress, or they might show other types of reactions. This just means that they don't have a consistent way of coping with the situation. So I could go into, why, infants will have these different types of attachment, but I won't. I'm afraid we don't have enough time to do that. So I'm going to continue on into gender. Okay. So one thing to remember the difference between sex and gender: sex is biological, gender is psychological and societal. Okay. So when we talk about sex, we're talking about biological attributes and physiological attributes. Okay. So you think about, the sex organs, X chromosome, XX chromosome, XY chromosome, things like that. Okay. The stuff that an individual is born with, the physical characteristics, things like that. Okay. So that's what we mean when we talk about sex. Okay. Gender, these are a person's feeling of, being, either male or female. Okay. Or identifying with a particular gender. Okay. So gender is becoming, a wider and wider field of study. Okay. And so we have, people, who are more open about how they feel and more open about their identities. And you can have somebody who might identify as transgendered, where they might have been born in a biologically male body, but their gender, okay, they feel more feminine, or they feel more like a female, and they might identify as a female and seek to go through the transition to female. Okay. And so that's going to gender identity. Okay. So this is your feeling of being, either male or female, like how you identify yourself. So for example, I identify as a female. Okay. I identify as a female. Okay. And I was born in a female, biologically female body, so I would be considered cisgender. Okay, so If anybody in the chat would like to chime in about this, okay, or, you know, add any more information for this, that would be great. But gender is how you feel and identify yourself, and sex is your biological characteristics. And sexual orientation is not the same as gender identity, okay? Sexual orientation, this is the direction of a person's romantic interests. So if, you know, if I had, you know, as a female and someone who identifies as female, if I had towards other females or others who identify as female, I would be considered a lesbian. That would be my sexual orientation. Or some people might use the term homosexual, even though some people might have, you know, issues with the term homosexual, okay? You have to ask people how they prefer to identify themselves in order to be respectful of that. And so, however, you know, in reality, you know, I prefer people who identify as male. So my sexual orientation is colloquially, or, you know, in normal everyday terms, known as quote unquote straight, okay, or heterosexual. And so some people will take issue with the term straight because they feel like that's, you know, discriminatory and that's demeaning and things of that nature. So, and if you're talking to somebody, it's a really good idea, especially if you're in a space where you have different people of different gender identities and sexual orientations, ask them how they prefer to be identified, okay? And so you want to show respect for people. So let's talk about gender constancy and gender schema. So gender constancy, this is the idea that children, especially with children, they have this idea that the gender doesn't change. So for example, people who are transgender, okay, and I know people who are transgender, they will tell me, okay, that they knew that they, so for example, if somebody was born in a male body, that they did not feel like a male from a very early age, okay? And so it's not as if they just woke up one day and decided, oh, I want to be a female. They knew from an early age, okay, that they didn't, you know, they did feel like they didn't fit in their body, okay? So children have this idea that gender doesn't just change, okay? And gender schema, this is one way that gender is developed. And so gender schema theory means that, you know, children see that gender, when as they're growing up, they see gender as categories, especially in, you know, in a binary sense, especially, you know, how children are raised. So children will see gender as a very important category, and will sometimes, as you know, depending on the culture they're living in, they will, you know, sort different characteristics into the different genders, okay, as they learn what's considered quote unquote gender appropriate, okay? So that's gender constancy and gender schema, okay? And so as far as, you know, the proposed causes of sexual orientation, research shows that this is something that is inborn, okay? So in the past, many people used to believe that sexual orientation was just a choice that somebody makes, but the thing is, this is something that someone is born with, okay? So this is not something that a person just wakes up and decides, oh, I want to, you know, I want to be romantically attracted to men or women, okay? So this is something that is inborn, okay? And most research now supports that, okay? So let's kind of move on to cognitive development according to Piaget. So schemas, again, we talked about schemas. Those are frameworks, mental frameworks. Assimilation and accommodation. Assimilation, this is where you basically take some new information and it fits neatly into your schema, okay? Accommodation, this is where you have to change your schema, okay? So for example, you meet somebody and you have to change your stereotype about a particular group, okay? So for example, if you have assumptions about a particular group of people, then you meet somebody who doesn't fit your stereotype, then you have to change your idea about that particular group of people. So that's an example of accommodation, okay? So let's move on to Piaget stages. Sensory motor. This is the stage where babies are in. So babies, you think of a baby walking around putting everything in their mouth, okay? They're touching, they think basically for moving and sensing, okay? Moving and sensing, that's where babies are, okay? And babies develop something known as object permanence, where they start to learn that, just because they can't see it, it's still there. So there comes a point where you can no longer just, hide something from babies. Babies start looking for something. That means they've developed object permanence. They know it's there even though they can't see it, okay? Pre-operational stage, this is preschool. Pre-operational stage, children, these are children who, they're in preschool, they're doing a lot of pretend, they have, they do animism because they believe everything is alive. They don't really have any logic, okay? So they're egocentric. This doesn't mean that they are, greedy or anything. It's just that they assume that everybody sees the world in the same way that they do, okay? They assume everybody sees the world in the same way that they do, okay? The concrete operational stage, this is where you have children who are school-aged. This is where you have children who are doing logical operations. They're doing things like math, reading, things like that, and they can think logically about things that they can see or they can touch, okay? So they understand something known as conservation. So they understand that just because the amount of something changes, it doesn't mean that, or excuse me, I'm sorry. Just because the shape of a container changes, that doesn't change the amount. So just because you pour liquid into a tall or thin glass, that doesn't mean you have more liquid. It's just that the liquid is taking the shape of the glass, okay? And then the formal operational stage, that's what young adults are in and adolescents are in. So that's abstract thinking, okay? So being able to do a hypothesis test, being able to do hypothetical thinking and debating and think about spirituality and society and things like that, anything like that, okay? So I need to move on. I know I'm going fast, but we have a lot of information to cover. So in Erickson, he was part of the psychoanalytic view, okay? But he focused on how people interacted with others and how people fit into a social group. So trust versus mistrust, this is babies. Babies are figuring out whether or not the world is a safe, trustworthy place. Autonomy versus shame and doubt, this is when children, for think of toddlers, they're learning to be more independent. If they are not allowed to be independent within reason, then they might feel shame and they might feel doubt about their abilities. Initiative versus guilt, this is preschool. So this is when children are taking initiative. They're learning to start things on their own. And if they're discouraged from taking initiative, they feel guilt. Industry versus inferiority, this is children who are in school, they're learning their skills and they need to be encouraged in their skills. Identity versus role confusion, these are teenagers. They're thinking about what their roles are in society, who they want to be, things of that nature. Intimacy versus isolation, these is young adults, so they're looking for a partner or just looking for somebody to be close to. Okay, generativity versus stagnation, these are people in middle age. They are looking for a way to leave something for the next generation, usually through child rearing or working in a job that gives back to the community in some way. And ego integrity versus despair, this is towards the end of life. And this is what people go through as they're getting closer to death and they think about whether or not their life was worth living. And if they feel that they have lived a good life, they feel a sense of integrity. If not, they feel a sense of despair. On to parenting styles, okay, Baumrind identified 3 main parenting styles. You have authoritarian, authoritative, permissive. Authoritarian, they're very strict, very little communication from the child to the parent, a lot of communication from the parent to the child. It's my way or the highway. Okay, so that's authoritarian. Authoritative, this is a parent that is more relaxed. They still have boundaries, they still have rules, but they allow for a little bit more negotiation when it's appropriate, and they allow the children to speak their minds. The children don't always get what they want, but there's more back and forth between the parents, and the parents have have boundaries. Permissive style, this is where the parents just basically spoil the kid and let the kid do whatever they want, okay? So you can kind of think of authoritarian parents keeping their kids on a short leash, permissive parents letting their kids just run completely wild and spoiling them, and authoritative parents, these are parents who sort of build a fence around their kids, saying they have some freedom of movement, there are boundaries, okay? All right, moving on to the stages of moral development, okay? Stages of moral development. So the pre-conventional stage, this is morality that is based on things like, crime, the punishments, okay, punishments and rewards. So you can think of a child who, is afraid to take a cookie from the cookie jar because they're afraid of getting punished, okay? And that's why they don't take a cookie from the cookie jar. So under pre-conventional, there's punishment and obedience and naive hedonism. So punishment and obedience, will I get caught and punished? Naive hedonism is what's in it for me, okay? Conventional level, okay? The conventional level, this is, the individual thinks about the standards and abides by the laws of society. So their morality is based on what are the laws that we have to follow, and also what will other people think of me. So the two substages are social approval and societal norms and laws. Okay, so social approval, this is where most teenagers are. Social norms and laws, that's where most adults are. So most adults are concerned with, maintaining law and order. And most teenagers, they're more concerned about social approval. And some adults are concerned about social approval, but that's really where where most teenagers are. Finally, post-conventional, this is where people are concerned about universal ethical principles just beyond laws. So this is where more older adults are. So the two sub levels are social contracts and universal ethical principles. So things like, social contracts, a person might think about, what is justice, what is equality, and they'll consider the morality of laws, and they'll challenge laws. And so they might write their representatives, or they, if they feel like a law is immoral, okay? And then you have the universal ethical principles. This is where somebody, focuses more on, what is better for humanity than following the law, more than following the laws, okay? So back during the Vietnam War, many people went to jail instead of participating in the draft because they thought that the war was morally wrong, okay? And we already spoke about dementia and Alzheimer's disease as we were talking about memory. And again, this will be recorded, this session will be recorded so that you can go back and listen, okay? And so here in the addendum, and in your handbook that you might have received for your particular text, there's an addendum, so make sure you take a look at that. So this has more information about separation anxiety, stranger anxiety, disorganized attachment, and gender schema theory, okay? So so that is development. Does anybody have any questions about development? Please type them in the chat if you have any questions. So gender, okay. So gender, identity, and gender. So gender, you can kind of think of gender as the categories, okay? And gender identity is a person's identifying with a particular gender. And I had already mentioned Skinner, Baumrind, and things of that nature earlier in this session. And remember, this session will be recorded. So it would be a good idea for you to know about Skinner and Baumrind and Ivan Pavlov and so forth. And Javier is absolutely right. Centration is a type of egocentrism. So children who are young, particularly preschool children, they have a hard time, with understanding that something can have multiple aspects to them. So, for example, mommy is only mommy, and mommy is not also, there's no way that mommy can also be a sister or a daughter. Mommy is only mommy. Okay, that's an example. We'll get to psychological disorders a little bit later. Thank you. Let's see. All right. So if there are no further questions, we're going to move on to stress and health. Or I think we should go ahead and go on to personality. So Alicia, would you be ready to do personality?
Yes.
Okay, that would be great because I think stress and health should go with the disorders and the therapy. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and Alicia, I am going to pass presenter to you. So are you going to want to share any your screen at all?
I guess it can just stay on the page that you had it on. Can you do that?
Okay. Yeah, sure, I can do that. I can do that. So, sure, I can do.
Just let me know when you need to start.
So everybody, please mute your cameras and please mute your microphones. And Laura, can you please, Professor McKnight, can you please pass host back to me?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm now the presenter. All right, so I will go back to sharing my screen here. All right, so
You're going to have to remain presenter in order for your screen to be shared, but Alicia can go ahead and talk.
okay, you're on, Alicia. I'm passing the mic to you.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Can y'all hear me? Just let me know if you cannot. Okay, I'm going to talk about personality.
Alicia, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Behaving. The ability to perceive a person's personality well may help you to predict how they will behave in the future. The oldest psychological approach to understanding personality is the psychodynamic approach. This was founded by Sigmund Freud. This approach focuses on the role of the unconscious thoughts, feelings, and memories in the human behavior. Freud was influenced by the work of neurologist Jean-Martin Charcot, who worked with female patients mostly and had diagnosed them with hysteria, okay? Hypnosis as an experiment, and he and Freud found that under hypnosis, many of the hysterical patients reported having experienced a traumatic sexual experience, such as sexual abuse as children. So, to go on, I'm going to discuss the process that takes place in the conscious, preconscious, and unconscious mind. Okay, the conscious mind is easily accessible. The conscious mind includes thoughts and memories that are aware and are currently processing. The preconscious mind consists of thoughts and memories that are just beneath the surface of the conscious mind, okay? And the unconscious, these are thoughts that are not readily accessible, okay, or memories. The unconscious mind is outside of awareness and is not readily accessible. You might consciously be reading a book, for example. In the book, the mother dies, and the child is left alone. In your preconscious mind, you could, if asked, recall your own mother's death when you were 12, but buried deep inside of your unconscious mind might be a more traumatic memory. This memory will The unconscious memories will affect both your conscious reading of the story and the preconscious memory of your mother's death. Now I'm going to discuss and identify the functions of the id, the ego, and the superego. Freud proposed that the mind is divided into three components: the id, the ego, and superego, and that the interactions and conflicts among the components create our personality. Okay, so first we have the id. The id is entirely unconscious. All right, it's the just remember, it's the pleasure principle, and that's your desire for immediate gratification. And we can blame smoking, drinking, watching porn, and engaging in reckless behaviors. All right, our superego represents our sense of morality and ought, what we ought to do. The superego tells us all the things that we should not do, or the duties and obligations of the society. The superego strives for perfection, and when we fail to live up to its demands, we feel guilty. And I always associate the id and the superego as our devil and our angel. So our devil is going to tell us, I want that. I want it now. Come on, we can do this. We can do it. And our superego is over here saying, no, no, no. Should you really be doing that? Oh, no, we should not. So anyway, let's move on. So let's talk about conscious controller or decision maker of personality, the reality principle. The ego serves as the intermediary or the moderator, all right? The ego serves as the moderator between the desires of the id and the constraints of the superego, all right? We may wish to scream, to yell, to hit, and yet our ego normally tells us to wait, reflect, and choose a more appropriate response. So we can think of the ego, or the id, the ego, and the superego as this. The id is, I want that, and I want it now. The superego, good people don't. The ego, on the other hand, is going to say, let's figure out a way to work together. Right, let's move on to defense mechanisms. The purpose of defense mechanisms in Freud's theory. Freud believed that the defense mechanisms were essential for effective coping with everyday life. Psychological disorders, mainly anxiety, occur when there is a conflict or imbalance between the motivations of the id, the ego, and the superego. Defense mechanisms are unconscious psychological strategies used for coping with anxiety and to maintain a positive self-image. The first one that we're going to discuss is repression. Repression is pushing anxiety arousing thoughts into the unconscious. A way to think of this is a person who witnessed his parents having sex and is later unable to remember anything about that event. All right. The next one that we're going to discuss is projection. Projection is disguising threatening impulses by attributing them to others, okay? So a man with a powerful unconscious sexual desire for women claims that women use him as a sex object. You know, there's plenty of guys out there who will say, oh, them girls, they're always after me. All they do is run and chase me. I can't get them off, but really it's him. He's the one that's using them. All right, so now we move on to displacement. Displacement is diverting threatening impulses away from the source of the anxiety and towards a more acceptable source. The example that's given is a student who is angry at her professor for a low grade lashes out at her roommate who is a safer target of her anger. But I can do one better than that one. So you are mad. Your child, they're running amok, you're trying to do your homework and you can't get them to settle down for nothing. You could swear somebody gave them a pint of ice cream and they ate the whole thing. So instead of taking that anger out on that child, maybe you could take a break from your work and go and hit the punching bag. So releasing that anger out on the punching bag, not your child, might help you in a bigger way. All right, and now we're going to move on to reaction formation. Reaction formation is making unacceptable motivations appear as their exact opposite. All right, making unacceptable motivations appear as their exact opposite. An example of that is Jane. Jane is sexually attracted to her friend Jake, but she claims in public that she intentionally dislikes him. A memory of mine is when I was a little girl, I liked a little boy who was in my class. For whatever reason, I liked him. I had a little crush on him. But I used to tell my friends, oh, I can't stand him. He's so gross. His butt is big. His, lips are big. I don't like him. But in actuality, I liked him a lot because when he moved away, I think I cried. All right. So now we're going to move on to denial. Denial is an outright refusal to admit or recognize that something has occurred or is currently occurring. An example of this will be drug addicts. Often these people deny that they have a problem at all. And also another example I want to throw out there is victim of traumatic events like women who get beat or battered in their relationships. A lot of times other people can see that there is clearly a problem and those women will say, oh no, there's no problem, not at all. Okay. Now I want to summarize, I want to talk about and summarize psychosexual stages, okay? There's five of these stages. Freud argued that personality is developed through a series of stages focusing on pleasure from a different part of the body. Freud believed that sexuality begins in infancy, all right, and that the appropriate resolution of each stage has implications for later. Psychosexual stages are classifications for separating age periods in the developmental psychology. The divisions for research and discussion are infant, toddler, early childhood, middle childhood, and adolescence. The first stage in psychosexual stages is oral. Oral stage is the time from birth to 18 months, okay? From birth to 18 months. The pleasure comes from the mouth in the form of sucking, biting, and chewing. The next stage is anal. Anal begins from 18 months to 3 years, and this pleasure comes from bowel and bladder elimination and the constraints of toilet training. The third one is phallic. Phallic is anywhere from 3 years to 6 years of age. The pleasure comes from the genitals, and the conflict is with sexual desires for the opposite sex partner. All right, the next one, the fourth, is 6 years to puberty. Sexual feelings are less important in these years. And the last one is genital. Genital is puberty and older. It's important to note that in this stage, if all of the prior stages have been properly reached, then mature sexual orientation develops. Now we're going to move on to Big 5 personality traits. Okay, traits are relatively enduring characteristics that influence our behavior across many situations. For example, she is honest, he is friendly, she is an extrovert, he is an introvert. Personality traits are important because they help explain consistencies in our behavior.
Hey, Alicia, you're doing a really great job, but if you don't mind, can you mind picking up the pace just a little bit so that you were just going over the basics of the concepts, but you're doing a great job. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Personality traits are measured by using personality tests where people give self-reports for their own characteristics. The Big 5 model of personality has states that there are 5 essential underlying traits, dimensions that are stable across time, cross-cultural, share, and explain a significant proportion of behavior. So a good way to remember this is remember the word ocean. Ocean is for openness to experience, which is, this is the person with a vivid imagination, rich vocabulary. They are curious and open to experiences. Consciousness, this is the self-disciplined, well-planned. They also follow strict schedules and are on time to work. The next one is extroversion. They are the life of the party. They can get along with any kind of people from diverse backgrounds. They like to talk, and also they like to draw attention to themselves. All right. Agreeableness. These are the people, they are interested in people's feelings. They care about other people's emotions, and they are generally friendly, helpful, and willing to compromise. The neurotism, this person, they are not usually relaxed. They get upset and are disturbed easily, and they are emotionally unstable. Those who score high in this area are more likely to interpret and minor frustrations as hopelessly difficult. They may have trouble taking clearly, they might have trouble thinking clearly, making decisions, and coping effectively with stress. The view of humanistic theorists. The second approach after psychodynamic is humanistic. Humanistic supporters embrace the notion of free will. This approach is client-centered. Humanistic psychologists focus on the underlying motivations that they believe drive personality. This approach also is based on the self-concept, which is the set of beliefs about who we are, and self-esteem, which is the positive beliefs about ourselves. Now we're going to go on to Abraham Maslow, and this approach is the hierarchy of needs. He explained personality based on a pyramid, okay? At the base of the pyramid, you'll find the lowest level of motivations like hunger, thirst, and safety. Maslow argued that only when people are available to meet the lowest level needs are they able to move on to achieve the higher level needs of self-esteem and eventually self-act. Which is the lowest level, is the need to feel the world is organized and predictable, need to feel safe, secure, and stable. The next one is love and belonging, and this is the need to love and be loved, to belong and to be accepted, the need to avoid loneliness and alienation. The next one is esteem, and this is your need for self-esteem, achievement, competence, and independence. The need for recognizing and respecting recognition and respect from others. And the last one is self-actualization. And this is the need to live up to one's fullest and unique potential. And like I said, self-actualization, which is the motivation to develop our innate potential to the fullest possible extent. Now we're going to talk about the social cognitive view of personality. The founder of this term is Albert Bandura, and his views states this: social cognitive theories focus on the complex relationships between what you think, what you feel, and how you act. Explains that personality development as learning that occurs through interactions with others. An example of this would be a child with ADD or ADHD does not act the same as a shy child. And also, a parent does not speak in the same way to an active child as they would to a quiet child. Self-efficacy is a person's personal judgment of his or her own ability to succeed in reaching a specific goal. For example, quitting smoking or losing weight, or a more general goal, for example, continuing to remain at a set weight level. All right. Reciprocal determinism. The environment as well as individuals influence personality. That's what is stated here. It also explains the interactions between environmental factors, cognitive and personality, and behavior. They go on to give an example. An example would be a parent is under stress at work and yells at an active child. Then that active child turns and throws a tantrum, causing a parent to be late to work. Then the tardy parent snaps at a customer, loses a sale. The parent returns home and blames the child for the loss of that sale. The child smashes the parent's cell phone. The parent misses a call from the office. Both the parent and the child become more aggressive. All right, we're going to talk about behavior genetics. A variety of research techniques that scientists have used to learn about genetic and environmental influences on human behavior by comparing the traits of biologically and non-biologically related family members. Okay, and also the second part is behavioral genetics is based on the results of family studies, twin studies, and adaptive studies. My last little section here is going to talk about the differences between a self-report inventory and a projective personality test. The self-report inventory is a psychological test used in personality assessment. The inventory is in the form of a survey or questionnaire. Self-report inventories ask direct questions about traits, values, interests, behaviors, and personality types. There is no correct answer. It is based on opinions and perceptions. They are brief and they take like 5 to 15 minutes. And on the other hand, you have projective test. It measures areas of your unconscious mind. Things that are measured, for example, are like your fears, your doubts, your attitude, and personality characteristics. Many employers use this kind of test to find the right candidate for their work environment. Here, a person responds to vague stimuli, revealing hidden emotions and inner conflicts projected into the test. And that's it. Thank you very much, and good luck on your test.
All right, well, thank you very much, Alicia. You did a fantastic job. I appreciate that. Thank you very much. That was great. Yay! Fantastic. All right, so next up is Caitlin Weathers with Stress and Health. Caitlin, are you ready?
Yeah, I'm here. I don't know if you want me to use the same slide that we have already up, or if you want to see my screen here. I just have the book that coincides with it if y'all want to use it as a reference point. But otherwise, it's the same thing on the left-hand side. It's just both of them juxtaposed next to each other.
Oh, okay. So are you okay with the screen as it is?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, yeah, and I'll just go through it. So thank you very much. And thank you again, Alicia. You did a great job. And Caitlin, you have the mic. Go ahead.
Okay, chapter 14, stress, lifestyle, and health. Key terms, stress versus stressors. Stress is the complex experience with physiological and emotional elements. That's going to be rapid heartbeat, sweaty palms, the physical symptoms that stress causes. Stressors are the actual experience that we face with emotional or physical threats. Those are called stressors. It says in the text here, stressors are not always adverse or undesirable events. For example, everyone would agree that breaking up with a romantic partner is a stress-inducing experience, yet developing a relationship with a new romantic partner can also be perceived as stressful. Students think of exams as stressors, but classes with few exams may also be stressful due to the lack of information a student has about his performance. In fact, any kind of stimulus or situation that requires us to confront the unknown or experience a sense of loss of control can be a stressor. So it can be good or bad, like running into a teacher at a grocery store or something, or an old friend, or someone who you didn't expect to see. Could be either a pleasant experience or not. Next term, social readjustment rating scale, or the SRRS. It's like a testing tool that they use in psychology. It was developed by Thomas Holmes and Richard, I believe it's pronounced Raw. I haven't Googled that. That's how I would pronounce it. In 1967, developed a measure of life events that might lead to stress. It is, I believe, 43 potentially stressful events, each of which have a numerical value. I don't know if y'all have ever seen tests like that. Have you ever experienced X, Y, and Z, and to what effect? Was it mild 1, moderate 2, severe 5? They were using this scale, or have used this scale. I don't know if it's still used. I would assume it's still used to determine potential for certain events to happen, such as a soldier ending up in a hospital based on these numbers. Most catastrophic or not, less of a potential to end up in a hospital. That makes sense. Moving on quickly. We are already 1 minute over our time. Post-traumatic stress disorder. That term isn't specifically in this writing or the reading, but I think it's fairly common. In the glossary, it says a chronic stress reaction characterized by experiences and behaviors may include intrusive and painful memories of the stressor event. Be characterized by symptoms or even such as having jumpiness or being jumpy or getting jumpy, having persistent negative emotional states, feeling down, depressed, moody, anxious, feeling detachment from others, getting angry, experiencing outbursts, or wanting to avoid or isolate any kind of events or people that would remind you of that stressor. Is how you would determine post-traumatic stress that I'm going to look here. Next term, hassle.
Hey, Caitlin, you're doing a fantastic job, but if you don't mind, if you would please go ahead and move a little bit closer to your microphone, if you don't mind.
Sorry.
No, you're doing great. Thank you.
Is this better or worse, or no different?
That's a little bit better. Thank you.
Okay, hassles, daily hassles, losing things, traffic jams, loss of internet service, all involve daily pressures and demands that are just going to happen throughout life that make things a little bit more of a struggle, that can potentially become overwhelming and ultimately compromise our sense of well-being. The learning objective in this, describe the daily impact of daily hassles on stress and health. I think it would be important to express like daily hassles. I'm just reiterating what I just said, but it's uncontrollable, if there's too much going on, like a traffic jam, you're sitting in traffic for 2 hours and you had only anticipated that it would be 30 minutes because you only live really like a walking distance away and you hadn't expected all of this to happen, could, potentially you could lose your job or something. It could become really serious and then life-threatening. How am I going to pay my rent? How am I going to pay for food? Things like that are hassles. That can be moderated and prevent things like that from happening. Important terminology. Next topic, health psychology. These 3 terms: biopsychosocial model, health psychology, and psychoneuroimmunology. Health psychology is the specialty that focuses on interactions among biological factors, behavioral factors, and social situations and their effects on health and illness. Health psychologists rely on, next term, biopsychosocial model of health. This model posits that psychology and social factors are just as important in the development of disease as biological causes, such as germs and viruses, or COVID-19 or coronavirus. This model replaces the older biomedical model of health, which is important. I think a lot of people are probably thinking about this right now. The older model was primarily in consideration of physical or pathogenic factors contributing to illness. I think COVID-19 in large part, with everyone staying home, not everyone is getting sick. A lot of people that do get sick are getting better, but a large part of what we're seeing is a lot of people who are staying at home are having to deal with issues of social isolation, depression, anxiety, etc. In terms of like numbers of how many people are now calling in to get psychiatric assistance over the phone have just skyrocketed. Okay. Thanks to advances in medical technology, there is a growing understanding of the physiology underlying the mind-body connection, and in particular, the role that different feelings can have on our body's function. Health psychology researchers working in the field of psychoneuroimmunology, for example, are interested in understanding how psychological factors can get under the skin and influence our physiology, especially immune system functioning, in order to better understand how factors like stress make us sick. That covers this topic. Describe the effects of stress on the immune system. There's more reading on the HPA axis that we're going to skip over. That's not what's in this terminology here. Next term, general adaptation syndrome, was developed by physiologist Hans Silly? I believe it's Silly. Studies stress by examining how rats responded to being exposed to stressors such as extreme cold, infection, shock, or excessive exercise. He found that regardless of the source of the stress, the rats experienced the same series of physiological changes as they suffered the prolonged stress. Silly created the term general adaptation syndrome, terminology important here, to refer to the 3 distinct stages of physiological change that occur in response to long-term stress. 1, alarm stage, 2, resistance stage, 3, exhaustion stage. 1, 2, 3. First stage, alarm stage, is the initial jolt that releases cortisol in the body. Second stage is resistance, when you're now becoming adapted to it. But because of the becoming adapted and the exposure, you kind of return to a normal state. It's kind of like you're used to it. It's homeostasis, general level of stress there. You're used to this always being there. But eventually, stage 3, exhaustion, you just can't do it anymore. Your body runs out of its reserves and energy and immunity. Blood sugar levels decrease. Your tolerance to stress in general decreases. Mentally, you're exhausted. Physically, you're exhausted. More prone to getting physically ill. Your immunity levels are lowered. You're more susceptible. And organs can begin failing, and illness or possible even death in exhaustion stage of the general adaptation syndrome. Moving on, explain the differences between problem-focused and emotion-focused coping. Problem-focused coping one attempts to manage or alter the problem that is causing one to experience stress. Emotion-focused coping efforts consist of changes to reduce negative emotions associated with stress, can include avoiding, minimizing, and distancing. Chapter here. 38, it's only been 8 minutes. Problem-focused coping, going back again, is attempting to deal with a stressful event by changing the situation that causes stress. Sometimes, however, solutions are not readily available or we are overwhelmed by negative emotions and unable to act. My first thought, problem-focused coping, would be like the Mr. Fix-It guy who's like, one to just solve all the problems. But it says here, negative emotions, not always possible. Moving on to emotional, focused coping, such as stress reaction, are useful in warning us about potential danger and in mobilizing our response to it. So it is a good thing that we have them. However, we also need to learn how to control our emotions to prevent them from letting our behavior get out of control. Responding to stress through management of our emotions is known as emotion-focused coping. For example, it is easier to respond to stress if we can interpret it in positive ways. Kelsey, 1999, don't know who that's referencing, found that some people interpret stress as a challenge, whereas others see the same stress as a threat. People who viewed stress as a challenge had fewer physiological stress responses than those who viewed it as a threat. So if you look at a threat as an opportunity, you're more able to tackle the problem, focusing on it, changing your mindset, looking at it in a different way, and being able to regulate your emotion to better solve the problem by just seeing it differently as something achievable, a new achievable goal. Just by reframing. All right, a few more terms, we're almost done. Positive psychology. Scientific area of studies seeking to identify and promote those qualities that lead to, can y'all hear me? Hello?
I can hear you.
Okay.
You're doing great.
Thank you. Scientific area of studies seeking to identify and promote those qualities that lead to happy, fulfilled, and contented lives. Let's see if it's in here. It gets skimmed over in the actual reading portion, positive psychology. So I have the term. Describe the effects.
Hey, so Caitlin, positive psychology is a lot about, figuring out how to, how people can be happier, how people can reduce the stress in their lives and, cope better with stress and things like that.
Thinking, I didn't write down any separate studies of psychology to compare them, but I guess even for time, it's probably not necessary to have to explain different ones to compare them to.
Oh yeah, you're doing great. Thank you. You're doing great.
All right. Resilience. Resilience is the ability to maintain healthy functioning despite chronic stress and to recover from its effects once the stress period has ended. Suzanne Cabosa and her colleagues have argued that variations in resilience can be described by a measure known as hardiness. Our next term. Individuals with high scores on measure of hardiness are those who are more positive overall about potentially stressful life events, who take more direct action to understand the causes of stressful events, and who attempt to learn from them what may be of value for the future. Hardy individuals use effective coping strategies, and they take better care of themselves. People who report that they have positive social relationships with others, the perception of social support, also demonstrate resilience. Social support buffers us against stress in several ways. For one, having people who can trust and rely, having people we can trust and rely on helps us directly by allowing us to share favors when we need them. These are the direct effects of social support. But having people around us also makes us feel good about ourselves. These are the appreciation effects of social support. Also defined as soothing and often beneficial support of others, can take different forms such as advice, guidance, encouragement, acceptance, emotional comfort, or tangible assistance. And that's it. That's the last term for me.
All right.
Thank you for letting me share.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you, Caitlin. You did a fantastic job. Yay.
Thank you for staying after 9:30.
Oh, I know. Yeah, we have got a lot of information we got to cover. We got a lot of information we got to cover, but you're doing great. And also, everybody, this meeting is going to be recorded and it's going to be shared when that recording is available. Okay, so thank you all. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and jump into psychological disorders. All right, so the psychological disorders. So this is probably the real reason you came to this class. So abnormal behavior, okay? So what constitutes a psychological disorder? Well, with psychological disorder, it has to deviate from cultural social norms. So it has to be different from what people might consider quote unquote normal in that society. It has to be maladaptive or dysfunctional. That means that it hinders a person's daily functioning. It means it interferes with their ability to work, their ability to take care of their family, things of that nature. Okay, and also cause personal distress, which means that it's upsetting to them or it's upsetting to their family members. And all of these three have to be in place in order for it to be a mental disorder, particularly the maladaptive part. Okay, so if somebody just deviates from cultural norms, but they're able to, maintain a job and everything like that, then they might just be eccentric. But if it keeps them from being able to hold down a job and take care of their family and adapt to social situations, then it's considered a mental disorder. And so I just saw a question about narcissism pop up. We'll get to that in a moment. Thank you. So DSM-5, the DSM stands for Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. It's currently in the 5th edition. So it goes through different editions because research about mental disorders is always evolving. So it's always evolving. So you have, as the research evolves and as findings, evolve about mental disorders, it becomes updated. Okay, so it goes through updates. So let's go ahead and also the DSM. Before I move on, I want to mention that it contains symptoms of the different disorders. It also contains the statistics about different mental disorders as well. So it's a diagnostic tool used by clinicians. So moving on to the anxiety disorders. So everybody feels anxiety, right? Especially now with this current health crisis that we've got going on, okay? So you're scared, you're worried, things like that. But for it to be considered a disorder that can be diagnosable, it has to be going on for more than a couple of weeks, and it also has to hinder your everyday functioning, okay? So what we got going on right now is unprecedented, and I know we keep hearing that word over and over again, so forgive me for using that word, but it's kind of hard to apply it to this time. And although there are people who have predispositions toward anxiety disorders who might have those disorders, triggered or activated, okay? But a diagnosable anxiety disorder is where somebody feels anxiety, okay, for more than 2 weeks, okay, and it interferes with their ability to effectively cope, okay? So generalized anxiety disorder in general, this is where a person just has a general feeling of anxiety and worry. They worry about everything under the sun, and they worry about anything and everything. And they can't really put their finger on why they worry so much, and it does hinder their ability to function effectively. Okay, so that's generalized anxiety disorder. A person just worries, okay, a lot. They worry a lot, and it's to the extent to which it affects their ability to function, okay, in their day-to-day lives, and they really can't put their finger on why they worry, okay? Panic disorder, this is where a person has feelings of sudden onsets and unpredictable onsets of extreme terror. And I'm not talking about, you know, being afraid from watching like a horror movie. I'm talking like being so terrified, like you're afraid that you were going to die. So people who experience panic disorder, they will talk about how when they have a panic attack, it feels like they're so terrified, it feels like they're going to die. And they, you know, they have heart palpitations, they hyperventilate, and, you know, it's almost immobilizing for them, and it's extremely distressing. And these panic attacks do disrupt a person's daily life. Okay? So a panic disorder, this is where a person has sudden onsets of intense terror, rapid heart rate, rapid breathing, things like that, okay? Specific phobias, this is where a person has an unreasonable fear of of an object or situation. So you can have a phobia of spiders, like arachnophobia. You can have a phobia of, you know, the ocean. You can have a phobia of crossing bridges. You can have a phobia of heights. You know, but the key word here is unreasonable. Okay, so it's normal to be a little bit nervous around a snake because snakes, you know, can be venomous. And, you know, I don't recommend going and touching snakes you see in the wild, especially if you don't really know how to identify them. Okay, I don't recommend it. I do not recommend it. Leave snakes alone, okay? Leave them alone. But a specific phobia of snakes would be somebody seeing a snake from across the room or even in an aquarium and running and screaming, okay? So it's not like, you know, ooh, there's a snake, let's, you know, give it a wide berth and stay away from it. It's more like running and screaming, just seeing it from across the room in a tank, okay? So that's a specific phobia. Social anxiety disorder. Social anxiety disorder, and I'll say one more time before I move on, leave snakes alone, okay? Leave them alone, okay? I don't want anybody coming out of here thinking that I said it's okay to, you know, mess with snakes. Leave them alone, okay? But let's move on. Social anxiety disorder. This is where a person feels nervous in social situations, and so this is where, you know, sometimes this is called social phobia, but this is where a person has extreme anxiety about social situations. And so this person, you know, they will have trouble talking to people on the phone or especially talking to people face to face, or they'll have, trepidation about, extreme trepidation about, you know, talking in front of audiences. This is not to be confused with agoraphobia. Agoraphobia is the fear of public spaces. So a person who has agoraphobia, they can be in their house, okay, and talk to someone on the phone, but they're completely terrified of leaving their home, okay? So many times people who suffer from agoraphobia, they can stay isolated, they can self-isolate in a house for many, many, many years. And so they're not afraid of talking to people. They can talk and text on the phone, but they're afraid of being out in the open. Okay, because they're terrified that something bad is going to happen. Let's move on to obsessive compulsive disorders. So obsessive compulsive disorders, these are the people who you might have heard of, you know, people who might do compulsive hand washing. With obsessive compulsive disorders, there's two key things here, okay? There are obsessions and there are compulsions, okay? The obsessions are intrusive thoughts that keep coming into a person's mind without their control. Usually these thoughts are very, very upsetting, okay? Like a person might have very upsetting thoughts about, you know, passing a dangerous illness, okay, or getting a dangerous illness, and they keep having these thoughts and they won't stop. And so what they'll do is they'll engage in the compulsions in order to alleviate that anxiety, okay? And so it's kind of a self-perpetuating cycle. They have the obsessions, they do the compulsions to relieve the anxiety, anxiety goes down. So that's kind of like negative reinforcement, okay? So the next time that person has the anxiety from the obsessions again, they are going to go into the compulsion to relieve themselves of the anxiety, okay? That's obsessive compulsive disorder. Dissociative identity disorder, this is where a person has multiple personalities or alters in the same person. This is different from schizophrenia. Don't get dissociative identity disorder and schizophrenia mixed up. Dissociative identity disorder, this is where a person has several personalities in the same person, and they will, and these different personalities are known as alters. And usually many researchers and people who've done case studies think that dissociative identity disorders is more than likely due to very, very severe abuse during childhood. But dissociative identity disorders, that's where you have multiple personalities, okay? And these are distinct personalities, and the person switches, you know, between these different disorders, okay? Schizophrenia is different. Schizophrenia, a person has one personality, okay? They just have one personality, okay? So they do not have multiple personalities. But with schizophrenia, this person, they have what are called hallucinations and delusions. So a person with schizophrenia, they will hallucinate, they will sense things that are not there. So they'll see things that are not there. They'll hear things that are not there. They might hear voices. Sometimes they have tactile hallucinations, so they might feel like there are bugs crawling on them. And also people with schizophrenia, they have what are called delusions, or they have beliefs that are not true. When I'm talking about beliefs that are not true, I'm talking about somebody who believes that they are Satan, or someone who believes that they are some other religious figure, or somebody who believes that they are the president of the, you know, United States, or anybody, you know, like that. You know, it's just, you know, but when in reality, they are a person, you know, everyday person living in suburbia. Okay, so we're talking about, or somebody who, you know, believes that some people are out to get them, like, you know, delusions of persecution. Okay, so there are different possible causes of schizophrenia. So one of the possible causes of schizophrenia, and I just want to warn you right away that correlation is not causation. So some of the research shows that when, you know, during pregnancy, if the mother has the flu during pregnancy, then the baby is more likely to develop schizophrenia. But remember, correlation is not causation, okay? But but having the flu during pregnancy and schizophrenia in the child later on in life are correlated with each other. Now, another possible cause of schizophrenia is also genetics, appears to have a very strong genetic component. Also, brain formation. So the spaces in the brain, the ventricles, okay, in the brain that are in the middle that allow the cerebral spinal fluid to go into the brain, that are naturally there. Sometimes those ventricles can be enlarged, okay? Also, stressful events. Stressful events is also, you know, thought to possibly trigger the onset of schizophrenia, but this is usually because somebody has a genetic predisposition. So you've got genetics and the environment interacting with each other, like in epigenetics, okay? Let's see, let me open up chat here. I believe I might have gotten a correction. So yeah, so as a licensed professional, we try to stay away from diagnosing characters portrayed in Hollywood. That is right, because Hollywood doesn't always get disorders correct. Okay, so you want to be aware of that. Okay, so those are the possible causes of schizophrenia. okay? And it's very helpful to learn because schizophrenia also, another possible cause of schizophrenia is very high dopamine, okay? So dopamine, okay, that is the neurotransmitter that's related to reward, okay? Feelings of reward and making you feel good. Okay, that's not, not serotonin. Okay, so dopamine makes you feel good when you're rewarded for something, but high levels of dopamine are associated with schizophrenia. Okay, they're associated with schizophrenia. All right, so let's go on to major depressive disorder. So the major symptoms of major depressive disorder, this is where you have a situation where a person has a lot of feelings of sadness and hopelessness that go on for more than 2 weeks. Okay, so it's normal to feel very sad at times, particularly when a loved one dies. But if these feelings of sadness and hopelessness hang around for longer than 2 weeks, that is an indication that a person might be struggling with a disorder. So, and also, major depressive disorder is more than just feeling sad. A person might have reduced interest or pleasure in things that they used to enjoy, like if they had a hobby they used to enjoy, they no longer care about it. Changes in appetite, changes in weight, fatigue, a lot of fatigue. A lot of times they just feel tired and they feel like they can't get out of bed. Problems thinking and concentrating, feeling worthless, and unfortunately recurrent thoughts of death and suicide. Okay, and it is something that is very, very sad. And we'll talk about suicide in a little bit. And so I just want to warn you, if information about suicide is hard for you to talk about, you're free to leave and listen to this later. But we are going to talk a little bit about the possible, risk factors involved in suicide. So before we go to talking about risk factors for suicide, we talk about bipolar disorder. Okay, so bipolar disorders, this is where you have, the symptoms of major depression during the depressive phase, but the person goes between a depressive phase and what's called the mania or the manic phase. And the manic phase or the manic episode is not necessarily always happy. Okay, sometimes people are happy during the manic episode, but most of the time they're very agitated and they have very high energy. And just sometimes during the manic phase, they won't sleep for days. Okay, sometimes in some cases they might, get very agitated and they might, lash out at others during the manic phase in some cases. And, it's very, very difficult for the sufferer to cope with, to go between the depressive phase and the manic phase. And then in some cases, if I recall correctly, there are some, rapid cycling bipolar disorder where, there's a faster oscillation between the depressive phase and the manic phase. Okay. So now we're going to talk about the risk factors for suicide. Now, the risk factors for suicide. Now, before I talk about this, I want everybody to be aware of the suicide hotline. Okay, I want everybody to be aware of that. Okay, especially during now when a lot of people are suffering right now. So the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, that's 1-800-723-8255. That's 1-800-273-8255. And if you Google National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, you can find their website, and they have a chat feature too. So if you don't feel comfortable, calling. So I just wanted to make you aware of that. So, if you need help or someone you love needs help, you can help them get help. So let's talk about the risk factors for suicide. Okay. So somebody with a psychological disorder, they're at a higher risk. Gender, so females, they tend to, or women rather, in girls, they tend to engage in more suicidal ideation. They tend to attempt more. And male, like men and boys, they tend to complete suicide more often because men and boys, they tend to choose more violent means. Okay, where, you know, girls, they'll do things like, you know, swallow a bunch of pills, whereas boys, they might use a firearm or, you know, some other more immediately deadly means, okay? Prior attempt, so if somebody has previously attempted suicide, they are more likely to attempt it again. Family history of suicide, okay? And exposure to suicide. So if a person's been exposed to a suicide, they're more likely to attempt it. If a person's experienced abuse, incarceration, substance abuse, risky behavior, age, low levels of serotonin, poor physical health, acute stressors, wanting to die, capacity for suicide, for example, somebody who doesn't fear death, and also there are some cultural norms, okay? So those are the risk factors for suicide. And if you or anybody you care about, you know, like for example, if somebody that you really care about starts talking about wanting to die, you know, take it seriously, talk to them, make sure that they're safe, and help them get help, okay? So, you know, you don't want to let this go by. You want to take this seriously. And if you are ever feeling this way, reach out to the HCC Counseling Center, reach out to the Lifeline. You know, you're not alone. You really are not alone, and this will pass. I know that sounds like a trite saying, but it really will pass. This pain doesn't last forever. I know from personal experience, okay? So the personality disorders. So personality disorders is a disorder in which the core personality of the person is disordered and they have a pervasive pattern of maladaptive patterns of behavior, which means that their way of adapting to the world is very dysfunctional, okay? So, you know, a person who suffers from schizophrenia, when they get treatment, the symptoms are alleviated and they can adapt somewhat better to the world, but a person with a personality disorder, they have a pervasive pattern of adapting to the world in a way that is harmful to themselves and to others. So let's talk about antisocial personality disorder. So these are what people, they used to call psychopaths or sociopaths. These are the people who have no remorse for what they do. They essentially don't have a conscience and they don't care that they're hurting people. So at the very, you know, at best, they might be con people. They might con others out of money, and they lie, cheat, and steal, and they have no remorse for it. And many times, you know, the people with antisocial personality disorder, you know, some serial killers have, you know, are thought to have had antisocial personality disorder, but usually, but a lot of times though, these are people who just, you know, lie, cheat, and steal, and they just don't care. They just, and they break the law and they just don't care about the effect their behavior has on others, okay? Paranoid personality disorder, these are people who have a pervasive pattern of distrusting others. They feel like everybody's out to get them. They just don't trust others, okay? They just simply don't trust others, okay? That's paranoid. They have a pervasive pattern of that. Borderline personality disorder, these are people who are very, very, how do I say this? They have a difficulty in relationships, okay? So they have a difficult time and a lot of inconsistency in coping with relationships. So a person who suffers from this, they have a hard time getting close to people, close to them. And so what happens is they'll idolize a person one day and they'll become very, very attached to a person. And then the next day, because of some perceived slight, the person that they previously idolized and loved becomes their mortal enemy. So one day they'll love you, they'll practically worship the ground you walk on. The next day, you're their mortal enemy if they feel insulted by you or if they think that you've hurt them in some way. Okay, and you know they have very inconsistent patterns of relating to people. Okay, so it's about how they relate to others. Narcissistic personality disorder. So narcissistic personality disorder, these are the people who think that they, you know, who try to act like they're better than everybody else. They think they're more deserving than others. And what the way that they'll act is they want all of the attention on them. They want everything to revolve for them and for what they want and what they feel like they need, and other people's needs don't matter, okay? And so they have very grand, so many times narcissists, they have very grandiose visions of themselves. You know, they will view themselves as being more valuable, more entitled than others, okay? And a lot of times they have trouble understanding the emotions of others. So that is a disorder. Let me check the addendum for the disorders to make sure I didn't. Okay, so I talked about agoraphobia. Okay, so that's the disorders. So we've got one more to go through, everybody. Thank you for hanging in there. We're going to go in for the therapies, okay? So thank you. So Alicia, are you up for doing the therapies real quick? Are you still here, Alicia?
I didn't get to that one.
Oh, okay. No, it's all right. I understand. You're working very hard, and I appreciate that. And I apologize. I forgot about that. So many of our students who are presenting, they have jobs as well as going to school, everyone. So give them a big round of applause, you know, in the chat for their hard work and their effort, okay? Because they're going to school, taking care of their families, and they're doing this and keeping up with their schoolwork. So they really deserve your respect and your accolades. So I will go ahead and do the therapies. I'll just breeze through these, okay? So psychoanalysis, this is a type of therapy that's based on Freud's psychoanalytic perspective. So what in psychoanalysis, this is where a therapist seeks to figure out what's going on in a person's unconscious. So what they will do is they will let a person just free associate, which means just let them talk about whatever comes to mind. They try to get clues into what's going on in their unconscious. So they'll do things like ask them about their dreams. They'll ask them about, you know, how to, you have to ask them about, what were you having, what were you dreaming about? Maybe ask them about the relationships with their family members. But what the psychoanalyst tries to do is that they try to get clues of the unconscious. Because remember, as a person, you don't have direct access to your unconscious. So the psychoanalyst has to look for clues. So they look for it through dream analysis. They might also kind of listen to the person free associate to kind of hear any little nuggets of the unconscious pop up and see if they can, put two and two together to figure out what might be going on with the client. And they might also use transference where the client relates to the analyst in a way that they might relate to a person like in a relationship. So for example, sometimes clients fall in love with their therapist. This is known as transference. And what's going on according to psychoanalysis is that the client is trying to work deep down, trying to work out their issues with relationships with others. And so the job of the therapist is to guide the client, to an understanding of their own feelings and why they have the feelings that they do and why they might have issues with relationships that they do, okay? So the next one is client-centered therapy, okay, or person-centered therapy. So this is Carl Rogers, a humanist perspective. And so person-centered therapy is all about helping the person align with their ideal self. And so the therapist will use reflective speech. So things like, mirroring the person's thoughts and feelings. And so what they might do is say things like, well, that sounds like that was very traumatic for you, okay? Or they might say, well, if I'm hearing you correctly, they'll repeat back what they heard from the client, and then the client can say, well, yeah, that's exactly right, or no, it's actually like blah, 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 okay? So that the therapist can kind of get a sense of where the client is and where they need to lead the client to. Also, it's about unconditional positive regard. So the therapist recognizes the inherent value of a person. I mean, it's not like they pat them on the head and say, oh, everything you do is wonderful, But for example, to somebody who has been doing drugs, they say, look, what you're doing is harmful. You're hurting yourself. You're hurting your family, but you are worthy as a human being, and you are worthy of getting the help that you need. Okay. So that's unconditional positive regard. You don't like their behavior, but you care about the person. Okay. And empathy, this means that the therapist tries to put themselves in the shoes of their client so they can have an idea of what the client's feeling, and also be genuine, okay? Not just wear a mask and pretend that you care, actually care about the client, okay? And so that's client-centered therapy. Behavior therapy, so if you think back to learning, using all of those principles of learning to help a person. So it could be helping a person to quit smoking, helping a person to, help kick another addiction. That might be part of a person's rehab plan, things of that nature. Okay, behavioral therapy is sometimes used with children with autism as well. So that's behavioral therapy, using the principles of behavior. So the token economy, that's part of behavioral therapy. Okay, cognitive therapy, this is where a therapist tries to use, use different thought processes and try to help a client have better thought processes. So if a person comes in and says, well, I just had a horrible breakup and I'm never going to find love again, the therapist tries to help the client rearrange their thought processes to be more reasonable and say, you know what, this breakup was really difficult, but it is possible for me to find love in the future. Okay, to try to help their thought processes be more reasonable. And so that's cognitive therapy. One type of therapy that has gotten a lot of traction in research is cognitive behavioral therapy. And so it's kind of a mix between cognitive therapy and behavioral therapy. So the therapist will use a lot of talk therapy. They will help the client think in more rational ways, but they will also they might give the client homework, okay? And they'll use a lot of praise to encourage the client, things like that, okay? And then there's biomedical therapy. So there's biomedical therapy. So in biomedical therapy, these are things like drug therapies, okay? So things like, if you remember, like antidepressants like Prozac and Zoloft and Lexapro and things like that, that's a biomedical therapy. ECT, electroconvulsive therapy, is another biomedical therapy, and this is where a person is put under general anesthesia and a seizure is induced, and that's only used in very severe, cases of depression that doesn't respond to drug treatments, okay? And there is also transcranial magnetic stimulation, and this is the use of powerful magnets to help a person, okay, and is thought to be a possible alternative to ECT, okay? And finally, it's, again, know the difference between a psychologist and a psychiatrist. A psychiatrist has a medical degree. They went to medical school. They did everything you do in a medical school, and they've had their focus on psychology or psychiatry, okay? And they can prescribe medication, okay? They can prescribe medication. Then a psychologist, you have psychologists who, do therapy. Many times they'll have a master's degree with a license, and sometimes you'll have people who have PsyDs where they have a doctorate, but their doctorate is in clinical psychology. So, but a psychiatrist, they're the only ones who can legally prescribe medications. So that is the review. Thank you all for your time and attention. Please, everybody, be safe. And so I know that we went over a bit. We just talked a little bit about cognitive behavioral therapy a little bit earlier. But yes, you're very welcome. You're all very, very welcome. Thank you all for being here. It is greatly appreciated. Your time and attention are two of your greatest resources, and thank you for spending it with us, especially during this very difficult time. I wish you all the best of success. I wish you all the best in the days and months and weeks ahead. And please, good luck, take care, be safe, take care of yourselves, take care of each other. You're all very welcome. Great job, everyone. Thank you, Caitlin. Thank you, Alicia. Thank you, Nasheen. Good night, everybody. Thank you, Nasheen, Dr. N for Dr. Nasheen. And thank you, Professor McKnight, for helping and for helping to moderate. Your great help. Thank you all.
All right, have a good night, everybody.
Right,
Kate,
have a
get
good
something to
night.
drink.
All right, thank you.
Dr. Bruton, get something to drink.
I will.
Go use the bathroom now.
So Professor McKnight, will you please pass?
I already did.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, so I can, maintain this recording. Awesome. All right, everybody have a great one. You're free to go. This recording. Thank you. Have a good night. So hopefully this recording will be available tomorrow when it's done processing. And once it's done processing, I'll share the link with everybody. Okay. Thank you all so much.
All right. Good night.
Good night. Please take care. You're welcome. Thank you.
This was very, very helpful.
Awesome. 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 Take care. Be safe.
Yeah, I don't remember who was presenting. I'm
presenter.
Well, no, before, while someone was presenting, I messaged Denise and asked her if it could be put on the same website where all the final exam resources were located, and she was like, absolutely.
Yay.
So,
Awesome.
yeah. So that way it won't have to be one of those things where the instructor has to pass it out. Several times throughout your presentation, I went ahead and threw it up of, if you're just joining, the link will be available there. So that way they'll know where to find it and they don't have to rely on an instructor to post it, or if it's the link's broken or if it can't upload, it's just uploaded once and they can access it.
Awesome. Awesome. Thank you.
Okay.
All right. I'm going to quit the recording. I'm going to stop recording. Okay.
Okay.
All right. Recording is